You probably clicked on this to fall asleep, but before we start, drop a like and subscribe. Now dim your lights and let the darkness begin. Dr. Hayes moved through the Hall of Dynasties, a familiar space that had become increasingly unsettling in recent days. The early morning light filtered weakly through the high arched windows, casting long, distorted shadows of the colossal statues that lined the hall. She was making her routine pre-opening rounds, a task she usually relished. It was a time for quiet contemplation amidst the silent grandeur of the past, a moment to connect with the echoes of a civilization long gone. But today, a subtle disquiet clung to the air, a feeling that something was not quite right. It started subtly. A small alabaster canopic jar, usually positioned precisely at the foot of a noble's funerary bed replica, was now a few inches to the left, almost imperceptibly askew. She noticed it as she straightened a display card, her eye catching the slight misalignment. "Must have been bumped," she muttered to herself, adjusting it back into place. Then near the towering statue of Sekhmet, a small offering bowl made of faience, filled with meticulously arranged replica dates and figs for display, was rotated slightly, its decorated rim no longer facing outwards as it should. Again, it was minor, easily dismissed as a visitor's careless touch or perhaps a slight tremor during the night. She meticulously reoriented the bowl, feeling a flicker of annoyance at the carelessness, yet also a strange, unreasonable prickle of unease. As she continued her rounds, the anomalies continued, each one small, insignificant on its own, but cumulatively adding to a growing sense of disorientation. A papyrus scroll, carefully unrolled and displayed under glass, seemed to have shifted minutely, its protective weight slightly off-center. A collection of amulets, arranged in a precise chronological order within a glass case, had one or two that seemed to be facing in slightly different directions than the rest. Each time, Dr. Hayes attributed it to the vagaries of a busy museum, the occasional jostle of cleaning staff, or even her own overactive imagination. She was tired, she reasoned. The stress of the recent incidents, the unsettling pronouncements from Mr. Thorne, and the general air of unease within the museum were likely making her hypersensitive, causing her to see patterns where none existed. She reminded herself of the sheer volume of artifacts in the Grand Alexandria. Mistakes in placement, minor shifts, these were statistically bound to occur. It was the nature of a living, breathing museum, constantly visited, cleaned, and rearranged. To read anything more into these tiny discrepancies would be, she told herself firmly, bordering on the ridiculous. She needed to focus on the tangible, on the work that truly mattered, the cataloging of the newly arrived sarcophagus. The sarcophagus, a magnificent piece of dark gray basalt, had been delivered just days ago. A silent, imposing addition to the Hall of Eternity, the section dedicated to funerary practices and beliefs. It had been acquired through the Osiris Foundation, of course, like so many of the museum's most significant pieces. Mr. Thorne had personally overseen its arrival, his usual enigmatic smile playing on his lips as he watched it being carefully maneuvered into place. He'd offered little information about its provenance, simply stating it was a significant find from a recent dig in the Saqqara necropolis and would be a cornerstone of the museum's collection. His pronouncements, as always, were cryptic and imbued with an unnerving sense of importance. Dr. Hayes found herself drawn to the sarcophagus. Even before its official unveiling, even before she had begun the meticulous process of cataloging it, it held a strange fascination for her. It was larger than most she had seen, its surface smooth and cold to the touch, adorned with finely carved hieroglyphs that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light of the hall. The air around it felt different, heavier, imbued with a sense of ancient stillness that both intrigued and slightly intimidated her. She spent the rest of the morning in the Hall of Eternity, focusing her attention entirely on the sarcophagus. The cataloging process was painstaking, requiring careful photography, detailed measurements, and meticulous transcription of the hieroglyphic inscriptions. She set up her equipment, the soft glow of her lamp illuminating the dark stone, casting intricate shadows that danced across the carved figures. As she worked, she felt a sense of immersion, losing herself in the intricate details of the ancient artistry. The hieroglyphs, though she had studied them for years, seemed to possess a new vibrancy, almost as if they were whispering secrets just beyond her grasp. She began with the lid, carefully photographing each section, noting the intricate depictions of gods and goddesses, protective spells, and funerary scenes. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, indicative of a high-status individual. The basalt was flawless, the carving crisp and deep, suggesting it was commissioned by someone of significant wealth and power. As she traced the outlines of the figures with her finger, she felt a strange tingling sensation, a faint vibration that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. She dismissed it as static electricity, the dry museum air playing tricks on her senses. Lunch was a hurried affair, a sandwich eaten at her desk amidst stacks of research papers and cataloging notes. She felt a growing sense of urgency, a desire to delve deeper into the sarcophagus to unlock its secrets. The minor anomalies from the morning faded into the background of her mind, overshadowed by the imposing presence of the ancient artifact. She was a scientist, an archaeologist, and this was her domain, the meticulous study and interpretation of the past. She would not be distracted by shadows and whispers. The afternoon was spent meticulously transcribing the hieroglyphic inscriptions. They were primarily funerary texts, standard invocations to the gods of the afterlife, spells to protect the deceased on their journey, and declarations of the deceased's virtuous life. But as she progressed, she began to notice subtle variations, phrases that were slightly different from the standard funerary texts she was familiar with. There were repetitions of certain symbols, groupings of glyphs that seemed to emphasize themes of resurrection and transformation, almost to an obsessive degree. And then there were the cartouches, the oval enclosures that should have contained the name of the deceased. They were deliberately left blank. This was unusual, highly unusual. Sarcophagi, especially those of this quality, were almost always inscribed with the name and titles of the person they were intended for. The absence of a name was a deliberate omission, a blank space in the narrative of death and afterlife. It sparked a new wave of questions in Dr. Hayes's mind. Who was this sarcophagus intended for, and why was their name intentionally left out? Was it a mistake, an unfinished commission? Or was there a more deliberate, perhaps even ritualistic, reason for this anonymity? As the day drew to a close and the museum began to empty of visitors, Dr. Hayes felt a strange sense of reluctance to leave the Hall of Eternity. The sarcophagus seemed to emanate a silent pull, a magnetic force that kept her tethered to its presence. She packed up her equipment, double-checking her notes and photographs, feeling a growing sense of anticipation for the work that lay ahead. She knew that unlocking the secrets of this sarcophagus would be a long and complex process, but she was eager to begin. That night, Dr. Hayes slept fitfully. Her dreams were vivid, unsettling, unlike anything she had experienced before. They were fragmented, disjointed, yet imbued with an intense, almost visceral realism. She found herself wandering through vast, shadowy halls, lined with colossal statues that loomed over her like silent giants. The air was thick with incense, the scent heavy and cloying, and the sounds of chanting echoed from unseen chambers. The imagery was undeniably Egyptian, drawn from the very artifacts she worked with every day, yet twisted, distorted, imbued with a sense of menace. In one dream, she stood before a towering obsidian statue of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. Its eyes, made of polished black stone, seemed to fix on her, burning with an unnerving intensity. The statue slowly began to move, its massive hand reaching out towards her, its fingers long and skeletal. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a primal fear as the cold, stone hand drew closer. Then the dream shifted. She was in a vast, underground chamber, illuminated by flickering torchlight. Hieroglyphs covered the walls, glowing with an eerie luminescence. In the center of the chamber, a group of figures cloaked in dark robes chanted in a language she didn't understand, yet somehow recognized as ancient, primal. They were gathered around a raised stone altar, and on the altar lay the sarcophagus. Her sarcophagus. But it was open, and from within it, a dark, shadowy form began to rise, coalescing from the darkness, tendrils of smoke and shadow swirling around it. The chanting intensified, reaching a fever pitch, and the shadowy form grew larger, more defined, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, yet utterly alien and terrifying. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding in her chest, her skin slick with cold sweat. The darkness of her bedroom felt oppressive, heavy with the residue of the nightmare. She sat up in bed, trying to catch her breath to shake off the lingering fear. The images from the dream clung to her mind, vivid and unsettling. The obsidian statue of Anubis, the chanting figures, the shadowy form rising from the sarcophagus. They were all fragments of ancient Egyptian mythology, woven together into a tapestry of terror. She got out of bed and went to the window, drawing back the curtains to let in the pale pre-dawn light. The city lay spread out before her, a grid of light stretching to the horizon, a world away from the shadowy chambers and ancient rituals of her dreams. She tried to rationalize the nightmares, attributing them to stress, to overwork, to the constant immersion in Egyptian culture. But a nagging doubt persisted, a sense that there was something more to it, something connected to the museum, to the artifacts, to the sarcophagus. She made herself a cup of tea, her hands still trembling slightly. As she sipped the warm liquid, her mind drifted back to the anomalies she had noticed in the museum that morning. The canopic jar slightly out of place, the offering bowl rotated, the papyrus scroll shifted, minor discrepancies, easily dismissed as accidents. But now, in the cold light of morning, after the vivid terror of her nightmares, they took on a new significance. Were they really accidents? Or were they, like the nightmares, fragments of something larger, something more deliberate? The image of the sarcophagus in her dream flashed into her mind, open and empty, yet somehow not empty, with the shadowy form rising from within. She shivered despite the warmth of the tea. It was just a dream, she told herself again, just a product of an overactive imagination. But the feeling of unease persisted, a cold knot of dread in the pit of her stomach. She knew she couldn't ignore it. She had to investigate, to delve deeper, to understand what was happening in the museum, what was happening to her. The anomalies, the nightmares, the unsettling presence of the sarcophagus, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and she had to find a way to put them together. She finished her tea, a newfound resolve hardening her gaze. She would go to the museum early, before anyone else arrived. She would examine the anomalies more closely. She would study the sarcophagus again, and she would try to find some rational explanation for the unsettling events. But a part of her, a growing, insistent part, whispered that the explanation might not be rational at all. As she dressed, her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her dream, the details of the anomalies, the unsettling atmosphere in the museum. She remembered Mr. Thorne's cryptic pronouncements, Captain Olson's skeptical unease, the whispers of a curse among the staff. And then she thought of the blank cartouches on the sarcophagus, the deliberate omission of a name. A name left unsaid, a space left unfilled, a void waiting to be occupied. A chilling thought struck her, a sudden, terrifying realization that sent a fresh wave of cold fear through her. What if the sarcophagus was not meant to contain someone who had died? What if it was meant to contain something else entirely? Something that was not yet born? She hurried out of her apartment, the city still shrouded in the pre-dawn gloom. The streets were quiet, almost deserted, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of early morning traffic. As she walked towards the museum, she felt a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need to understand what was happening before it was too late. The anomalies, the nightmares, they were not random, they were not accidents. They were warnings, and she had a terrible feeling that they were just the beginning. She arrived at the museum while it was still dark, the massive building looming against the lightening sky, silent and imposing. She used her keycard to bypass the security system, the heavy doors clicking open with a hollow sound that echoed in the stillness. The interior of the museum was even darker, the shadows deeper, the silence more profound. She made her way through the deserted halls, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors. The air felt colder here, heavier, imbued with a sense of ancient stillness that seemed to press in on her. She went directly to the Hall of Dynasties, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to see the anomalies again, to examine them more closely, to see if she could find any pattern, any connection. As she entered the hall, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a heavy, cloying fragrance that was undeniably familiar from her nightmare. And the hall, it was different. The shadows seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light, the colossal statues looming even more menacingly than before. And the artifacts, they were not quite as she had left them. The canopic jar, which she had carefully repositioned, was now further out of place, almost halfway off the pedestal. The offering bowl was not just rotated, It was overturned, the replica dates and figs scattered across the floor. The papyrus scroll under its glass case was no longer just shifted, it was visibly unrolling further, the ancient script more exposed. And the amulets in the display case, they were no longer just facing different directions. They were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably moving. They seemed to be turning, shifting, rearranging themselves within the confines of the glass case. Dr. Hayes stood frozen, staring at the scene before her, her mind reeling. This was not her imagination. This was not accidental. The artifacts were moving, and they were moving with purpose. The minor anomalies of the morning were no longer minor. They were escalating, becoming more pronounced, more deliberate. And the scent of incense, the oppressive atmosphere, the echoes of her nightmares, it all coalesced into a terrifying realization. Something was happening in the Grand Alexandria Museum. Something ancient, something powerful, and something undeniably unnatural. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on the moving amulets. They were small, carved from faience and semi-precious stones, depicting various gods and symbols of protection. But now, as they shifted and turned, they seemed to be aligning themselves, forming some kind of pattern within the case. A pattern that was not random, a pattern that seemed to be intentional. And then she saw it. On the floor, near the overturned offering bowl, amongst the scattered replica dates and figs, there was something else. Something that hadn't been there before. A small, dark feather. Not a bird feather, but something darker, denser, almost metallic in its sheen. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. She cautiously approached it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she bent down to examine it more closely, a sudden gust of wind seemed to sweep through the hall, rustling the display cards, making the shadows dance, and carrying with it a faint whisper. A sound that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the museum itself. The whisper was indistinct, barely audible, yet it resonated deep within her, a primal sound that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her soul. It was a single word, repeated softly, insistently, carried on the wind, echoing in the silence of the ancient hall. A word that chilled her to the bone, a word that confirmed her deepest fears, a word that resonated with the imagery of her nightmares, the anomalies in the exhibit, the unsettling presence of the sarcophagus. The word was awakening. And in that moment, Dr. Hayes knew with a chilling certainty that the minor anomalies were not accidents. They were not random, they were signs. Signs of something ancient stirring, something long dormant reawakening within the very heart of the Grand Alexandria Museum. And the sarcophagus, the silent, imposing sarcophagus in the Hall of Eternity, was not just an artifact. It was a vessel waiting to be filled, and the rituals had begun. The word awakening hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement that settled deep within Dr. Hayes, resonating with a primal dread she couldn't shake. The scent of incense, stronger now, almost suffocating, seemed to amplify the word, imbuing it with an ancient, ominous weight. She stood amidst the subtly disturbed artifacts, the overturned offering bowl, the unrolling papyrus, the eerily shifting amulets, and the inexplicable dark feather, each detail now screaming a silent, unified message. Something was terribly wrong. She forced herself to move, a sense of urgency propelling her forward. She needed to document this, to have concrete evidence of what she was witnessing. Pulling out her phone, she began to take pictures, meticulously capturing the positions of the displaced artifacts, zooming in on the feather, recording the arrangement of the amulets within the case. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, the weight of her realization pressing down on her. This wasn't just museum mischief. This was something orchestrated, something deliberate, something ritualistic. As she finished documenting the scene in the Hall of Dynasties, the faint pre-dawn light began to strengthen, filtering through the high windows, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around the colossal statues. The museum, usually a place of quiet contemplation, now felt charged, alive with an unseen energy that prickled her skin and raised the hairs on the back of her neck. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. Captain Olson had to be informed, even if his skepticism was as solid as the museum's granite walls. She hurried out of the Hall of Dynasties and made her way towards the security office, her mind racing, trying to formulate a coherent explanation for what she had seen, for what she now knew was happening. The corridors were still deserted, the silence broken only by the soft echo of her footsteps. As she approached the security office, she could hear the low murmur of voices from within. Captain Olson was already on duty. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. Olson and two of his officers were gathered around a bank of monitors, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. Olson looked up as she entered, his brow furrowed with a mixture of fatigue and mild annoyance. "Dr. Hayes, you're in early," he said, his voice gruff. "Everything all right?" "Captain," she began, her voice slightly breathless. I think something is happening in the Hall of Dynasties. Something unusual." Olson sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Unusual? Like what?" "Another misplaced artifact. Look, Dr. Hayes, with all due respect, we've been over this. Things get moved, bumped, shifted. It's a museum, not a tomb." "No, Captain, it's not just misplaced," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "It's deliberate, and it's more than just a few inches. Things are overturned, unrolled, rearranged. And then there's a smell of incense in the air, Captain, a strong smell." Olson exchanged a skeptical glance with one of his officers, a young woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Incense, huh? Maybe someone from the cleaning crew used some air freshener. We've had complaints about the ancient artifact smell before, you know." Dr. Hayes shook her head, frustration rising within her. "Captain, this isn't air freshener. This is ancient incense, like what they used in temples, in rituals." She paused, taking a deep breath. And I think the artifacts are moving on their own." Olson finally straightened up, his skepticism momentarily replaced by a flicker of something else, perhaps curiosity, perhaps just a weariness of dismissing her concerns outright. "Moving on their own, Dr. Hayes, with all due respect, that's impossible." "I know it sounds impossible, Captain," she said, holding his gaze. "But I've seen it, or at least I've seen the evidence. Things are significantly out of place and it's not random. Please, Captain, just check the security footage from the Hall of Dynasties. From last night, see for yourself." Olson hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Dr. Hayes, let's take a look. But if this is some elaborate prank or just overactive museum gremlins, I'm holding you personally responsible for my lost caffeine intake." He turned to the young officer. "Miller, pull up the Hall of Dynasties cameras from Sector 4, midnight to 6 a.m. Officer Miller quickly typed on the keyboard, bringing up the relevant camera feeds on the monitors. Olson leaned forward, his initial skepticism still evident in his posture, but a hint of professional curiosity now flickering in his eyes. They watched in silence as the footage began to play, time-lapsed, showing the Hall of Dynasties in the still of the night. For the first few hours, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The statues stood silent and imposing, the artifacts resting peacefully in their displays. Olson was about to dismiss it as a false alarm when Dr. Hayes suddenly pointed at one of the monitors. "There, look." On the screen, barely perceptible at first, a small alabaster canopic jar, the very one she had noticed slightly askew earlier, began to move. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, a minute rotation to the left. Then, a few minutes later, it moved again, slightly further. Olson and his officers exchanged glances, a flicker of surprise replacing their skepticism. They continued to watch, their eyes glued to the monitors. As the night progressed, the movements became more pronounced, more frequent. The offering bowl slowly rotated, then tilted, eventually overturning, scattering the replica dates and figs. The papyrus scroll under its protective glass subtly unrolled further, the ancient script becoming more visible. And the amulets in the display case, initially still, began to twitch, then to turn, slowly rearranging themselves within their glass prison. The movements were not dramatic, not violent. They were subtle, almost hesitant, yet undeniably there. They were like the tentative movements of something waking from a long slumber, stretching its limbs, testing its newfound freedom. The security footage, silent and stark, provided irrefutable evidence of the impossible. The artifacts were moving independently. Olson watched the footage, his initial skepticism dissolving into a mixture of bewilderment and a growing unease. He was a man of logic, of facts, of tangible explanations. He dealt with security breaches, vandalism, occasional theft, but this was outside the realm of anything he had ever encountered. He replayed sections of the footage, zooming in, slowing down the playback, trying to find any rational explanation for what he was seeing. Could it be vibrations from the city's underground train system, faulty display mechanisms, some kind of elaborate prank using hidden wires or robotics? He desperately searched for a logical loophole, a way to dismiss the impossible evidence before his eyes. "Rewind to 03:17, he instructed Officer Miller, his voice now tight with a dawning apprehension. "Focus on the Sekhmet statue near the offering bowl." Miller rewound the footage and zoomed in on the area Olsen had indicated. They watched as the offering bowl slowly overturned. Then, just as the bowl tipped over, something else caught Olsen's eye. A faint shadow, fleeting and indistinct, seemed to flicker near the base of the Sekhmet statue, just for a fraction of a second. It was barely there, easily missed, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. "Pause," Olsen commanded. Frame by frame from 03:1722 to 03:1725. Miller advanced the footage frame by frame. As they scrutinized the grainy security footage, the faint shadow became slightly more defined. It was still indistinct, almost translucent, but it seemed to have a vaguely elongated shape, like a wisp of smoke or a fleeting distortion of the air itself. It appeared near the statue, lingered for a fraction of a second, and then vanished. Olsen leaned back in his chair, his face pale, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a stunned silence. He looked at Dr. Hayes, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning fear. Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Hayes nodded slowly, her own heart pounding in her chest. "I saw it, Captain. Something was there." Olsen ran a hand over his face, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible evidence with his ingrained skepticism. "Okay," he said finally, his voice regaining a semblance of its usual authority, though it still trembled slightly. "Okay, let's not jump to conclusions. It could still be something mechanical. Faulty sensors, maybe. Some kind of weird reflection." "Captain," Dr. Hayes said, her voice firm, "these are ancient artifacts. They're not wired up to sensors, and reflections don't move objects. Captain, something is happening in this museum, something unnatural." Olsen knew deep down that she was right. The security footage was irrefutable. The artifacts were moving, and there was something else there, something unseen, something spectral. He had to investigate to find a rational explanation, even if his gut told him that rationality was rapidly becoming irrelevant. "Miller," Olsen said, turning back to the young officer, "I want you to pull up all security footage from the Hall of Dynasties for the past week. Every camera, every angle, every night. And I want a full diagnostic run on the entire security system in that hall. Check for malfunctions, glitches, anything unusual. Davis," he said, turning to the other officer, "I want you to do a physical sweep of the Hall of Dynasties, top to bottom. Check for hidden wires, any signs of tampering, anything that could explain this movement. Leave no stone unturned." The officers nodded, their initial skepticism now replaced by a palpable sense of unease. They knew Olsen. They knew that if he was taking this seriously, then something was genuinely wrong. Olsen turned back to Dr. Hayes, his expression grim. "Dr. Hayes, I need you to walk me through everything you saw this morning, every detail, every anomaly. And then," he added, his voice hardening with a newfound resolve, "we're going to figure out what the hell is going on in this museum." Dr. Hayes spent the next hour meticulously detailing her morning rounds, pointing out each displaced artifact, describing the scent of incense, recounting the unsettling atmosphere in the Hall of Dynasties. Olsen listened intently, taking notes, his initial skepticism slowly eroding with each detail she provided. He questioned her closely, probing for any inconsistencies, any possible misinterpretations, but Dr. Hayes's account remained consistent, precise, and undeniably unsettling. While Olsen and his team launched their investigation, Dr. Hayes retreated to her office, the image of the moving artifacts and the fleeting shadow burned into her mind. She knew that mechanical failures or elaborate pranks were no longer plausible explanations. Something else was at play, something ancient, something connected to the artifacts themselves. And the word awakening echoed in her thoughts, a chilling premonition of something ominous to come. She sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of research papers and ancient texts, her mind racing, trying to find a framework to understand what was happening. The incense, the rituals, the moving artifacts, it all pointed to something ancient Egyptian, something connected to the very objects she studied. And then she remembered her dream, the shadowy halls, the chanting figures, the sarcophagus, the obsidian statue of Anubis. The dream, which she had initially dismissed as stress-induced, now seemed to be more than just a nightmare. It felt like a warning, a glimpse into something real, something connected to the unfolding events in the museum. She pulled out her research notes on ancient Egyptian rituals and beliefs, her fingers tracing the titles of the texts, searching for a thread, a clue, a connection. She focused on funerary rituals, on the beliefs surrounding death and resurrection, on the powers attributed to amulets and sacred objects. She reread passages about the gods and goddesses associated with the afterlife, Anubis, Osiris, Sekhmet, Thoth, their roles in the journey of the soul, in the protection of the deceased, in the cyclical nature of life and death. As she delved deeper into the ancient texts, a recurring theme began to emerge: the importance of lunar cycles in Egyptian religion and ritual. The moon, in its cyclical waxing and waning, was deeply symbolic, representing cycles of death and rebirth, of darkness and light, of chaos and order. Many ancient Egyptian festivals and rituals were timed according to lunar phases, particularly the full moon, which was often associated with heightened spiritual energy and divine power. A chilling thought began to form in Dr. Hayes's mind. The artifacts had started moving subtly, almost imperceptibly a few days ago, and the movements had been intensifying, becoming more pronounced, more deliberate with each passing day. Could it be possible that the artifact movements were connected to the lunar cycle? Could the approaching full moon be somehow amplifying the phenomenon, fueling the reawakening of whatever was stirring within the museum? She checked a lunar calendar on her computer. The full moon was in 3 days, 3 days. A cold dread washed over her as the realization solidified. The timing was too coincidental. The increasing intensity of the artifact movements, the unsettling atmosphere in the museum, her vivid nightmares, it all seemed to be converging towards the approaching full moon, as if something was building, something was reaching a crescendo. She remembered Mr. Thorne's cryptic pronouncements about the sarcophagus being a cornerstone of the collection, about its significance. His enigmatic smile, his unsettling pronouncements, his veiled interest in containing the phenomenon rather than understanding it, it all pointed towards a deeper, more sinister purpose behind the Osiris Foundation's involvement. And the blank cartouches on the sarcophagus, the deliberate omission of a name, the void waiting to be filled, it all suggested that the sarcophagus was not meant for a deceased individual, but for something else entirely, something that was not yet born. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The sarcophagus, the rituals, the lunar cycle, the word awakening, the pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a terrifying picture. She had a growing, sickening feeling that the Grand Alexandria Museum was not just a museum anymore. It was becoming something else, something ancient, something powerful, something dangerous. And the approaching full moon, she feared, was not just a celestial event. It was a trigger. A trigger for something unimaginable to be unleashed. She had to understand more, she had to research further, she had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The museum, the city, perhaps even the world might be in grave danger, and the countdown to the full moon had begun. The word awakening hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement that settled deep within Dr. Hayes, resonating with a primal dread she couldn't shake. The scent of incense, stronger now, almost suffocating, seemed to amplify the word, imbuing it with an ancient, ominous weight. She stood amidst the subtly disturbed artifacts, the overturned offering bowl, the unrolling papyrus, the eerily shifting amulets, and the inexplicable dark feather, each detail now screaming a silent, unified message. Something was terribly wrong. She forced herself to move, a sense of urgency propelling her forward. She needed to document this, to have concrete evidence of what she was witnessing. Pulling out her phone, she began to take pictures, meticulously capturing the positions of the displaced artifacts, zooming in on the feather, recording the arrangement of the amulets within the case. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, the weight of her realization pressing down on her. This wasn't just museum mischief. This was something orchestrated, something deliberate, something ritualistic. As she finished documenting the scene in the Hall of Dynasties, the faint pre-dawn light began to strengthen, filtering through the high windows, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around the colossal statues. The museum, usually a place of quiet contemplation, now felt charged, alive with an unseen energy that prickled her skin and raised the hairs on the back of her neck. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. Captain Olson had to be informed, even if his skepticism was as solid as the museum's granite walls. She hurried out of the Hall of Dynasties and made her way towards the security office, her mind racing, trying to formulate a coherent explanation for what she had seen, for what she now knew was happening. The corridors were still deserted, the silence broken only by the soft echo of her footsteps. As she approached the security office, she could hear the low murmur of voices from within. Captain Olson was already on duty. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. Olson and two of his officers were gathered around a bank of monitors, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. Olson looked up as she entered, his brow furrowed with a mixture of fatigue and mild annoyance. "Dr. Hayes, you're in early," he said, his voice gruff. "Everything all right?" "Captain," she began, her voice slightly breathless. I think something is happening in the Hall of Dynasties. Something unusual." Olson sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Unusual? Like what? Another misplaced artifact? Look, Dr. Hayes, with all due respect, we've been over this. Things get moved, bumped, shifted. It's a museum, not a tomb." "No, Captain, it's not just misplaced," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "It's deliberate, and it's more than just a few inches. Things are overturned, unrolled, rearranged. And then there's a smell of incense in the air, Captain, a strong smell." Olson exchanged a skeptical glance with one of his officers, a young woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Incense, huh? Maybe someone from the cleaning crew used some air freshener. We've had complaints about the ancient artifact smell before, you know." Dr. Hayes shook her head, frustration rising within her. "Captain, this isn't air freshener. This is ancient incense, like what they used in temples, in rituals." She paused, taking a deep breath. And I think the artifacts are moving on their own." Olson finally straightened up, his skepticism momentarily replaced by a flicker of something else, perhaps curiosity, perhaps just a weariness of dismissing her concerns outright. "Moving on their own, Dr. Hayes, with all due respect, that's impossible." "I know it sounds impossible, Captain," she said, holding his gaze. "But I've seen it, or at least I've seen the evidence. Things are significantly out of place and it's not random. Please, Captain, just check the security footage from the Hall of Dynasties. From last night, see for yourself." Olson hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Dr. Hayes, let's take a look. But if this is some elaborate prank or just overactive museum gremlins, I'm holding you personally responsible for my lost caffeine intake." He turned to the young officer. "Miller, pull up the Hall of Dynasties cameras from Sector 4, midnight to 6 a.m. Officer Miller quickly typed on the keyboard, bringing up the relevant camera feeds on the monitors. Olson leaned forward, his initial skepticism still evident in his posture, but a hint of professional curiosity now flickering in his eyes. They watched in silence as the footage began to play, time-lapsed, showing the Hall of Dynasties in the still of the night. For the first few hours, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The statues stood silent and imposing, the artifacts resting peacefully in their displays. Olson was about to dismiss it as a false alarm when Dr. Hayes suddenly pointed at one of the monitors. "There, look." On the screen, barely perceptible at first, a small alabaster canopic jar, the very one she had noticed slightly askew earlier, began to move. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, a minute rotation to the left. Then, a few minutes later, it moved again, slightly further. Olson and his officers exchanged glances, a flicker of surprise replacing their skepticism. They continued to watch, their eyes glued to the monitors. As the night progressed, the movements became more pronounced, more frequent. The offering bowl slowly rotated, then tilted, eventually overturning, scattering the replica dates and figs. The papyrus scroll under its protective glass subtly unrolled further, the ancient script becoming more visible. And the amulets in the display case, initially still, began to twitch, then to turn, slowly rearranging themselves within their glass prison. The movements were not dramatic, not violent. They were subtle, almost hesitant, yet undeniably there. They were like the tentative movements of something waking from a long slumber, stretching its limbs, testing its newfound freedom. The security footage, silent and stark, provided irrefutable evidence of the impossible. The artifacts were moving independently. Olsen watched the footage, his initial skepticism dissolving into a mixture of bewilderment and a growing unease. He was a man of logic, of facts, of tangible explanations. He dealt with security breaches, vandalism, occasional theft, but this was outside the realm of anything he had ever encountered. He replayed sections of the footage, zooming in, slowing down the playback, trying to find any rational explanation for what he was seeing. Could it be vibrations from the city's underground train system, faulty display mechanisms, some kind of elaborate prank using hidden wires or robotics? He desperately searched for a logical loophole, a way to dismiss the impossible evidence before his eyes. "Rewind to 03:17, he instructed Officer Miller, his voice now tight with a dawning apprehension. "Focus on the Sekhmet statue near the offering bowl." Miller rewound the footage and zoomed in on the area Olsen had indicated. They watched as the offering bowl slowly overturned. Then, just as the bowl tipped over, something else caught Olsen's eye. A faint shadow, fleeting and indistinct, seemed to flicker near the base of the Sekhmet statue, just for a fraction of a second. It was barely there, easily missed, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. "Pause," Olsen commanded. Frame by frame from 03:1722 to 03:1725. Miller advanced the footage frame by frame. As they scrutinized the grainy security footage, the faint shadow became slightly more defined. It was still indistinct, almost translucent, but it seemed to have a vaguely elongated shape, like a wisp of smoke or a fleeting distortion of the air itself. It appeared near the statue, lingered for a fraction of a second, and then vanished. Olsen leaned back in his chair, his face pale, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a stunned silence. He looked at Dr. Hayes, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning fear. Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Hayes nodded slowly, her own heart pounding in her chest. "I saw it, Captain. Something was there." Olsen ran a hand over his face, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible evidence with his ingrained skepticism. "Okay," he said finally, his voice regaining a semblance of its usual authority, though it still trembled slightly. "Okay, let's not jump to conclusions. It could still be something mechanical. Faulty sensors, maybe. Some kind of weird reflection." "Captain," Dr. Hayes said, her voice firm, "these are ancient artifacts. They're not wired up to sensors, and reflections don't move objects. Captain, something is happening in this museum, something unnatural." Olsen knew deep down that she was right. The security footage was irrefutable. The artifacts were moving, and there was something else there, something unseen, something spectral. He had to investigate to find a rational explanation, even if his gut told him that rationality was rapidly becoming irrelevant. "Miller," Olsen said, turning back to the young officer, "I want you to pull up all security footage from the Hall of Dynasties for the past week. Every camera, every angle, every night. And I want a full diagnostic run on the entire security system in that hall. Check for malfunctions, glitches, anything unusual. Davis," he said, turning to the other officer, "I want you to do a physical sweep of the Hall of Dynasties, top to bottom. Check for hidden wires, any signs of tampering, anything that could explain this movement. Leave no stone unturned." The officers nodded, their initial skepticism now replaced by a palpable sense of unease. They knew Olsen. They knew that if he was taking this seriously, then something was genuinely wrong. Olsen turned back to Dr. Hayes, his expression grim. "Dr. Hayes, I need you to walk me through everything you saw this morning, every detail, every anomaly. And then," he added, his voice hardening with a newfound resolve, "we're going to figure out what the hell is going on in this museum." Dr. Hayes spent the next hour meticulously detailing her morning rounds, pointing out each displaced artifact, describing the scent of incense, recounting the unsettling atmosphere in the Hall of Dynasties. Olsen listened intently, taking notes, his initial skepticism slowly eroding with each detail she provided. He questioned her closely, probing for any inconsistencies, any possible misinterpretations. But Dr. Hayes's account remained consistent, precise, and undeniably unsettling. While Olson and his team launched their investigation, Dr. Hayes retreated to her office. The image of the moving artifacts and the fleeting shadow burned into her mind. She knew that mechanical failures or elaborate pranks were no longer plausible explanations. Something else was at play, something ancient, something connected to the artifacts themselves. And the word awakening echoed in her thoughts, a chilling premonition of something ominous to come. She sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of research papers and ancient texts, her mind racing, trying to find a framework to understand what was happening. The incense, the rituals, the moving artifacts, it all pointed to something ancient Egyptian, something connected to the very objects she studied. And then she remembered her dream, the shadowy halls, the chanting figures, the sarcophagus, the obsidian statue of Anubis. The dream, which she had initially dismissed as stress-induced, now seemed to be more than just a nightmare. It felt like a warning, a glimpse into something real, something connected to the unfolding events in the museum. She pulled out her research notes on ancient Egyptian rituals and beliefs, her fingers tracing the titles of the texts, searching for a thread, a clue, a connection. She focused on funerary rituals, on the beliefs surrounding death and resurrection, on the powers attributed to amulets and sacred objects. She reread passages about the gods and goddesses associated with the afterlife, Anubis, Osiris, Sekhmet, Thoth, their roles in the journey of the soul, in the protection of the deceased, in the cyclical nature of life and death. As she delved deeper into the ancient texts, a recurring theme began to emerge, the importance of lunar cycles in Egyptian religion and ritual. The moon, in its cyclical waxing and waning, was deeply symbolic, representing cycles of death and rebirth, of darkness and light, of chaos and order. Many ancient Egyptian festivals and rituals were timed according to lunar phases, particularly the full moon, which was often associated with heightened spiritual energy and divine power. A chilling thought began to form in Dr. Hayes's mind. The artifacts had started moving subtly, almost imperceptibly a few days ago, and the movements had been intensifying, becoming more pronounced, more deliberate with each passing day. Could it be possible that the artifact movements were connected to the lunar cycle? Could the approaching full moon be somehow amplifying the phenomenon, fueling the reawakening of whatever was stirring within the museum? She checked a lunar calendar on her computer. The full moon was in 3 days, 3 days. A cold dread washed over her as the realization solidified. The timing was too coincidental. The increasing intensity of the artifact movements, the unsettling atmosphere in the museum, her vivid nightmares, it all seemed to be converging towards the approaching full moon, as if something was building, something was reaching a crescendo. She remembered Mr. Thorne's cryptic pronouncements about the sarcophagus being a cornerstone of the collection, about its significance. His enigmatic smile, his unsettling pronouncements, his veiled interest in containing the phenomenon rather than understanding it, it all pointed towards a deeper, more sinister purpose behind the Osiris Foundation's involvement. And the blank cartouches on the sarcophagus, the deliberate omission of a name, the void waiting to be filled, it all suggested that the sarcophagus was not meant for a deceased individual, but for something else entirely, something that was not yet born. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The sarcophagus, the rituals, the lunar cycle, the word awakening, the pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a terrifying picture. She had a growing, sickening feeling that the Grand Alexandria Museum was not just a museum anymore. It was becoming something else, something ancient, something powerful, something dangerous. And the approaching full moon, she feared, was not just a celestial event. It was a trigger for something unimaginable to be unleashed. She had to understand more, she had to research further, she had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The museum, the city, perhaps even the world might be in grave danger, and the countdown to the full moon had begun. The following days were a blur of heightened tension and frantic activity. Olson's security team, now fully alerted, descended upon the Hall of Dynasties. They conducted thorough sweeps, meticulously examining every display case, every statue, every inch of the floor and walls. Davis, armed with a thermal imager and a Geiger counter, reported nothing unusual, no hidden compartments, no unexpected temperature fluctuations, no radiation spikes. Miller, buried under hours of security footage, flagged several more instances of artifact movement across different nights, each instance subtly more pronounced than the last. The fleeting shadows reappeared sporadically, always near the statues, always indistinct, but undeniably present. The museum staff, initially whispering about curses and ancient magic, now spoke in hushed tones of incidents and security concerns. The unease was palpable, a thick fog of anxiety permeating the air. Even the visitors seemed to sense it, their usual chatter subdued, their movements slower, their gazes lingering on the artifacts with a newfound apprehension. The rituals, as Dr. Hayes had begun to perceive them, were indeed growing more complex. The artifact movements were no longer isolated incidents of slight displacement. They were becoming coordinated, almost choreographed. In the Hall of Dynasties, the canopic jars, once merely askew, were now arranged in a semicircle around a small alabaster offering table. The papyrus scroll, now significantly unrolled, displayed a section of hieroglyphic text that Dr. Hayes, upon closer examination, recognized as part of a summoning ritual, an ancient invocation to unseen forces. The amulets in their case were no longer randomly shifting. They were forming geometric patterns, aligning themselves in configurations that mirrored ancient protective symbols. The scent of incense, too, had intensified. It was no longer a faint, lingering aroma. It was a thick, cloying fragrance that hung heavy in the air, permeating the entire Hall of Dynasties and seeping into the adjacent corridors. It was a blend of myrrh and frankincense, Dr. Hayes identified, the classic scents of ancient Egyptian temples, but with an added, almost acrid note, something vaguely metallic and unsettling. Then came the chanting. It started subtly, a barely audible murmur, a faint resonance in the depths of the museum. It was Mrs. Davison, a long-serving museum attendant stationed in the Hall of Dynasties, who first reported it. A kindly, elderly woman with a keen ear and an even keener eye for detail, Mrs. Davison had been a fixture in the museum for over 30 years. "Dr. Hayes," she said, approaching Evelyn one afternoon, her brow furrowed with concern. "I hope I'm not imagining things, dear, but have you heard it? The humming in the hall." Dr. Hayes, already on edge, listened intently. At first she heard nothing but the usual ambient sounds of the museum, the distant murmur of visitors, the soft hum of the ventilation system. But then, if she strained her ears, focused her attention beyond the mundane, she could just discern it, a faint, low-frequency hum, almost subsonic, vibrating in the air, resonating in her bones. "Yes, Mrs. Davison," Dr. Hayes replied, her voice hushed. I think I hear it. What does it sound like to you?" Mrs. Davison leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Like chanting, dear. Very low, very quiet, but chanting. Like monks in a monastery, but older, much older." Dr. Hayes felt a chill run down her spine. Chanting. In conjunction with the incense, the symbolic arrangements of artifacts, the unrolling papyrus scroll, the rituals were escalating. They were becoming more complex, more overt, more undeniably deliberate. Later that day, a younger museum staff member, a nervous, fresh-faced security guard named Ben Carter, approached Olson with a wide-eyed, almost panicked expression. Ben was new to the museum, still finding his feet and prone to jumpiness, but the look on his face was genuinely alarming. "Captain Olson," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, I think I saw something. In the Hall of Dynasties, last night on patrol." Olson, already stretched thin and operating on minimal sleep, sighed inwardly. "Saw something, Carter. Like what?" "Another misplaced brochure. Look, we're all a bit on edge here, but try to stick to the facts." "No, sir, it wasn't brochures, sir," Ben insisted, his eyes darting nervously around the security office. "It was figures, sir, ghostly figures." Olson's eyebrows shot up. He exchanged a weary glance with Officer Miller, who subtly rolled her eyes. "Ghostly figures, Carter. Come on now. You've been listening to Mrs. Davison's curse stories again, haven't you?" "No, sir, honestly, sir," Ben pleaded, his voice trembling slightly. I was doing my rounds in the Hall of Dynasties around 0200 hours. Everything was quiet, just the usual shadows. And then near the statue of Thoth I saw them, two of them, sort of shimmering, transparent figures. They were moving around the statue like they were looking at it or doing something. Shimmering, transparent figures, Olson repeated slowly, his voice flat, trying to suppress a growing sense of exasperation. And what exactly were these figures doing, Carter? I don't know, sir, Ben admitted, his voice dropping even lower. They were just moving, kind of gliding around the statue, and then they just vanished. Poof, gone. Olson stared at Ben, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint of a prank. But Ben's eyes were wide with genuine fear, his face pale and clammy. He seemed genuinely terrified by what he claimed to have seen. Carter, Olson said, his voice softening slightly, are you feeling all right? Have you been getting enough sleep? Maybe you're just tired, stressed out. These things can play tricks on your eyes, especially in a place like this, with all the shadows and history. No, sir, I'm sure of what I saw, sir, Ben insisted, shaking his head vehemently. I wasn't tired, sir, I just had my coffee, and it wasn't shadows, sir, it was figures, ghostly figures. I swear, Captain, I'm not making it up. Olson sighed, rubbing his temples wearily. He was a practical man, a man of facts and procedures. Ghosts, spectral figures, supernatural phenomena, these were not in his job description. But the security footage, the moving artifacts, the escalating rituals, and now this, it was all starting to accumulate, forming a pattern that defied rational explanation. Even he, the hardened skeptic, was beginning to feel a prickle of unease. A creeping sense that something truly extraordinary and potentially dangerous was unfolding within the museum. All right, Carter, Olson said finally, his voice betraying a hint of reluctant seriousness. All right, I hear you. We'll look into it. You go get some rest, okay? And maybe lay off the late-night horror movies for a while. Ben nodded gratefully, relief washing over his face. He mumbled a quick thank you, sir, and hurried out of the security office, leaving Olson and Officer Miller in stunned silence. Miller turned to Olson, her usual no-nonsense demeanor slightly shaken. Ghostly figures, Captain, seriously. Olson sighed again, running a hand through his hair. I know, Miller, I know, it sounds insane, but with everything else that's been going on, I don't know what to think anymore. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the bank of monitors displaying the security feeds from the Hall of Dynasties. Pull up the footage from camera sector 3 last night, 01:55 to 02:05. Let's see if our ghostly figures made a cameo appearance. Miller quickly complied, bringing up the relevant footage. They watched in silence as the time-lapsed video played, showing the statue of Thoth bathed in the eerie glow of the emergency exit lights. For several minutes, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Just the silent, imposing statue, casting long shadows in the stillness of the night. Olson was about to dismiss it as another false alarm, another overactive imagination fueled by stress and museum lore. But then, just as the clock on the monitor ticked past 02:00, a faint shimmer appeared near the base of the Thoth statue. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, even more indistinct than the shadow they had seen earlier. But it was there. A fleeting distortion of the air, a momentary ripple in the fabric of reality. It flickered for a few seconds, then vanished, leaving no trace. But then a few seconds later it reappeared, slightly closer to the statue. And then again and again, each time shifting position, moving around the statue, as if something was circling it, examining it, interacting with it. And then another shimmer appeared, near the first one, equally faint, equally indistinct, but undeniably present. Two shimmering distortions, moving around the statue of Thoth, just as Ben Carter had described. Ghostly figures. Olson stared at the monitor, his mouth agape, his mind reeling. He replayed the footage, zoomed in, enhanced the contrast, trying to find any rational explanation for what he was seeing. But there was none. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't a glitch, it wasn't a trick of the light. It was something else, something spectral, something impossible. He turned to Miller, his face pale, his usual gruff demeanor completely gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief and dawning fear. Miller, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, did you see that? Two of them, just like Carter said. Miller nodded slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and apprehension. I saw them, Captain, shimmering figures near the Thoth statue. She paused, swallowing hard. Captain, do you think they're ghosts? Olson remained silent for a long moment, his mind struggling to process the impossible evidence before his eyes. Ghosts, spectral figures. It was ludicrous, absurd, utterly of his rational worldview. And yet he had seen them, with his own eyes, on the security footage, just like Carter said. He finally let out a long, slow breath, the weight of his disbelief finally giving way to the undeniable reality of what he had witnessed. I don't know, Miller, he admitted, his voice still hushed, almost reverent. I don't know what they are, but I saw them, and Carter saw them. And then I think, he added, his voice hardening with a newfound resolve, I think we need to take this ghostly figure thing very, very seriously. The news of Ben Carter's sighting, corroborated by the security footage, spread through the museum like wildfire. Whispers turned into open discussions, hushed tones into animated debates. The staff, already on edge, were now teetering on the brink of outright panic. Mrs. Davison, predictably, declared it a clear sign of the ancient curse taking hold, her pronouncements growing louder and more dramatic. Even the most skeptical staff members, faced with the mounting evidence, were beginning to question their own rationality. Dr. Hayes, witnessing the escalating unease and the growing fear among the staff, knew she had to intervene. She sought out Olson again, finding him in the security office, still poring over the security footage, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. Captain Olson, she said, her voice firm but calm, we need to talk. Olson looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. Dr. Hayes, you were right about everything, the artifacts moving, the rituals, the ghosts. He gestured towards the monitors, displaying the ghostly figures flickering near the Thoth statue. I saw them. Miller saw them. Carter saw them. I don't know what the hell is going on, but it's real. It's happening. I know, Captain, Dr. Hayes said, nodding slowly. And it's going to get worse. The full moon is in 2 days. I believe these events are connected to the lunar cycle. They're building towards something, Captain, something powerful. Olson leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ghostly figures on the monitor. So, what do we do, Dr. Hayes? Call in Ghostbusters, exorcists. I'm a security captain, not a paranormal investigator. Dr. Hayes took a deep breath, trying to remain calm and focused amidst the escalating chaos. We need to understand what's happening, Captain. We need to figure out what these rituals are meant to achieve, what entity they are trying to summon. And we need to find a way to stop it. Stop it, Olson repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. Stop ghosts, stop ancient curses, Dr. Hayes, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I'm not sure we're equipped to handle this kind of situation. We have to try, Captain, Dr. Hayes insisted, her voice firm. We can't just stand by and watch while whatever this is unfolds. We need to increase security, of course. But we also need to understand the nature of this phenomenon. We need to research, to analyze, to find any information that can help us. Olson hesitated for a moment, his skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence before his eyes and the growing sense of dread in his gut. He was still struggling to accept the reality of the supernatural, but he could no longer deny that something extraordinary, something potentially dangerous, was happening in his museum. And Dr. Hayes, despite her initial overactive imagination in his eyes, seemed to be the only one who had a grasp on the situation, the only one offering a path forward, however improbable it might seem. All right, Dr. Hayes, Olson said finally, his voice resigned but firm. All right, let's do it your way. Increased security, research, analysis, whatever it takes. We'll throw everything we've got at this. But, he added, his gaze hardening, if this goes sideways, if this gets out of control, I'm holding you personally responsible for explaining it to the mayor. Despite the gravity of the situation, a flicker of his old gruff humor returned. Dr. Hayes managed a faint smile. Understood, Captain, but I have a feeling, she said, her voice dropping to a hushed tone, that explaining it to the mayor will be the least of our problems if we don't figure this out soon. Olson nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the ghostly figures flickering on the monitor. He knew deep down that Dr. Hayes was right. They were facing something unprecedented, something beyond the realm of their experience, something ancient and powerful and terrifying. And the countdown to the full moon was ticking relentlessly onwards. He turned to Officer Miller. "Miller, I want round-the-clock surveillance on the Hall of Dynasties. Every camera, every officer we can spare. Double shifts, triple shifts if necessary. I want eyes on those artifacts and on those figures every second of every minute." "Understood." Miller nodded sharply, her initial apprehension now replaced by a sense of grim determination. "Understood, Captain. We'll watch them like hawks." Olson turned back to Dr. Hayes, his expression grim but resolute. "All right, Dr. Hayes, you do your research. I'll handle the security. Let's hope between us logic and whatever you call this ancient Egyptian mumbo-jumbo can get us through this." He paused, then added, a hint of genuine worry in his voice, "because I have a bad feeling about this. A really bad feeling." Dr. Hayes met his gaze, her own expression equally grave. "Me too, Captain, me too." The weight of the impending full moon, the escalating rituals, and the spectral figures now felt heavier than ever, pressing down on them, a silent promise of something terrifying about to be unleashed. The Grand Alexandria Museum, once a sanctuary of history and culture, was now poised on the precipice of something ancient and unknown, and they were running out of time to understand it, to control it, to survive it. The morning after the chilling discovery of the moving artifacts and the spectral figures, a sleek black car pulled up outside the Grand Alexandria Museum staff entrance. Mr. Silas Thorne emerged, his tailored suit immaculate as always, his dark hair perfectly coiffed, and that unsettlingly smooth smile playing on his lips. He moved with an air of quiet authority, bypassing the usual security protocols with a practiced ease that spoke volumes about the Osiris Foundation's influence. He was expected, of course, but his arrival felt less like a helpful intervention and more like a carefully orchestrated takeover. Dr. Hayes was waiting in the main lobby, Captain Olson by her side, both wearing expressions of weary anticipation. The early morning light, usually so welcoming in the grand space, felt muted and strained today, mirroring the atmosphere of the museum itself. As Thorne approached, he extended a hand towards Dr. Hayes, his smile widening slightly. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and even devoid of any discernible emotion, "so good to see you again. I trust everything is proceeding smoothly." Dr. Hayes forced a polite smile, though a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. "Mr. Thorne, thank you for coming so promptly. We have encountered some unexpected occurrences within the ancient Egypt exhibit." Thorne's smile didn't falter. Unexpected occurrences. Museums, especially those housing artifacts of such antiquity, are prone to minor eccentricities. Energy fluctuations, perhaps, static buildup, perfectly natural phenomena, I assure you. He waved a dismissive hand as if swatting away a bothersome fly. "The Osiris Foundation understands these things. We've dealt with similar situations before." Captain Olson, usually a man of few words, couldn't help but interject, his gruff voice cutting through Thorne's polished facade. "Energy fluctuations, Mr. Thorne. With all due respect, sir, we're talking about artifacts moving on their own, on security footage, and then we've had reports of other things." He hesitated, glancing at Dr. Hayes before continuing, "Spectral figures, sir, seen by multiple staff members." Thorne's smile finally wavered, just for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. He turned his attention to Olson, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Spectral figures, Captain. Are you suggesting supernatural phenomena?" His tone was laced with thinly veiled amusement, a subtle condescension that grated on Olson's nerves. "I'm reporting what my officers have witnessed, Mr. Thorne," Olson said, his voice hardening. "We have security footage. We have credible eyewitness accounts. Something is happening in this museum, something beyond energy fluctuations." Thorne sighed, a carefully crafted expression of weary patience. "Captain, I understand your concerns, but I assure you there is a rational explanation for everything. Stress, suggestion, overactive imaginations, perhaps. Museums can be atmospheric places, especially at night." He turned back to Dr. Hayes, his smile returning, brighter and more unsettling than before. "Dr. Hayes, I'm certain you as a scientist understand the importance of maintaining perspective and avoiding sensationalism." Dr. Hayes clenched her jaw, struggling to maintain her composure. Sensationalism. She had spent years studying ancient cultures, approaching her work with rigorous academic discipline, and now she was being accused of sensationalism for reporting undeniable anomalies. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I am a scientist, yes. And as a scientist, I rely on evidence. And the evidence, as Captain Olson has pointed out, is compelling. We have documented artifact movement, we have anomalous security footage, and we have multiple eyewitness accounts of unusual occurrences. To dismiss these as energy fluctuations or overactive imaginations is, frankly, irresponsible." Thorne's smile tightened, losing its warmth entirely. "Dr. Hayes, I appreciate your dedication, but I believe a more measured approach is required. The Osiris Foundation has considerable experience in these matters. We understand the sensitivities surrounding ancient artifacts and the importance of discretion." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the lobby, taking in the few early morning staff members who were discreetly observing the exchange. "We wouldn't want to alarm the public, would we? Or create unnecessary speculation?" "Speculation is already rampant among the staff, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Hayes retorted, her voice rising slightly. "Dismissing their concerns and the evidence will only fuel that speculation and erode their trust in museum management." Thorne's eyes narrowed, his smile vanishing completely. "Dr. Hayes, I think we need to be clear on a few things. The Grand Alexandria Museum is generously funded by the Osiris Foundation. We have a vested interest in its smooth operation and in maintaining its reputation." His voice was now laced with a subtle threat, barely veiled beneath the veneer of polite professionalism. "We believe it is in everyone's best interest to contain this situation, to address these minor eccentricities quietly and efficiently, without undue alarm." He turned to Captain Olson, his gaze cold and authoritative. "Captain, I am going to need you to restrict access to the ancient Egypt exhibit, effective immediately. No staff, no visitors, until further notice. Security personnel only under your direct supervision." Olson's jaw tightened. Restricting access to a major exhibit without any clear explanation would cause chaos and further fuel the rumors. But Thorne's tone brooked no argument. The Osiris Foundation's influence was undeniable, their power within the museum absolute. "Understood, Mr. Thorne," Olson said, his voice stiff. "I will implement the restrictions immediately." Thorne turned back to Dr. Hayes, his gaze now fixed on her, cold and assessing. "And Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth but firm, "I am going to need to review your research notes, your preliminary findings regarding these occurrences." He extended his hand again, this time with an open palm, expectantly. Dr. Hayes stared at his outstretched hand, a wave of indignation washing over her. Her research notes, the meticulous records of her observations, the fruits of her careful analysis, he was demanding them as if they were some kind of contraband. This wasn't about containing a situation, this was about control, about suppressing information, about preventing the truth from emerging. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed anger, "my research notes are my professional property. They contain sensitive data, hypotheses, preliminary conclusions. I am not comfortable handing them over without a clear justification." Thorne's eyes hardened, his smile replaced by a glacial expression. "Justification, Dr. Hayes. The justification is that the Osiris Foundation is funding this museum, and we have a right to be fully informed about any unusual developments within its exhibits, especially those that involve artifacts acquired and curated under our auspices." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Furthermore, Dr. Hayes, I am requesting these notes as part of an internal investigation, to assess the nature of these energy fluctuations, and to determine the appropriate course of action." Internal investigation. Dr. Hayes doubted that very much. This felt more like a cover-up, a calculated move to control the narrative, to bury the truth beneath layers of Foundation bureaucracy and corporate doublespeak. But she also knew that resisting Thorne directly, especially in front of Olson and other museum staff, would be futile and potentially detrimental to her position. She was caught in a power play, outmaneuvered and outgunned by the Osiris Foundation's reach and influence. With a sigh of resignation, Dr. Hayes turned and walked towards her office, Thorne following closely behind. Olson watched them go, his brow furrowed with concern. He didn't trust Thorne, not one bit. There was something about the man's smooth demeanor and veiled pronouncements that set his teeth on edge. In confiscating Dr. Hayes's research notes, that was a red flag, a clear indication that Thorne was not interested in understanding the situation, but in controlling it. In her office, Dr. Hayes reluctantly gathered her research notes, the meticulously organized files, the handwritten observations, the preliminary transcriptions of the papyrus scroll. Each page represented hours of careful work, of intellectual engagement, of her growing understanding of the ancient mysteries unfolding within the museum. Handing them over to Thorne felt like surrendering a part of herself, a violation of her professional integrity. Thorne watched her, his gaze unwavering, his presence filling the small office with an unsettling sense of pressure. As she placed the stack of notes on her desk, he reached out and took them, his fingers brushing hers briefly. His touch was cold, impersonal, devoid of warmth. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice regaining its smooth, almost oily tone. "I assure you this is purely a precautionary measure. We simply need to assess the situation thoroughly and ensure that all appropriate protocols are followed." He tucked the notes into a slim, black briefcase he had brought with him, snapping it shut with a decisive click. "In the meantime, Dr. Hayes, I would appreciate it if you would refrain from discussing these matters with other staff members, or with anyone outside the museum. Discretion, as I said, is paramount." Dr. Hayes stared at him, her anger simmering beneath a veneer of professional politeness. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low and steady, "I understand the need for discretion, but I am deeply concerned about what is happening in this museum. The artifacts are moving, spectral figures are appearing, ancient rituals seem to be unfolding. This is not a matter of energy fluctuations or overactive imaginations. This is something serious, something potentially dangerous. And suppressing information, restricting access, and confiscating research notes will not make it go away. In fact, I believe it will only make things worse." Thorne's smile flickered again, a brief, chilling expression that sent a shiver down Dr. Hayes' spine. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you are a brilliant curator, a respected scholar, but you are not equipped to understand the full scope of this situation. The Osiris Foundation is. We have resources, knowledge, expertise that you cannot even begin to imagine. Trust us, Dr. Hayes, we know what we are doing, and we will handle this discreetly, efficiently, and effectively." He turned to leave, his briefcase in hand, his smooth smile firmly back in place. As he reached the door, he paused, turning back to Dr. Hayes, his eyes locking onto hers with an unnerving intensity. "And Dr. Hayes," he added, his voice barely audible, "I would strongly advise you to focus on your cataloging work. The sarcophagus, for example, a truly magnificent piece. It deserves your full attention. Don't you agree?" With that chillingly ambiguous pronouncement, Thorne left the office, leaving Dr. Hayes standing alone, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Focus on the sarcophagus. It sounded less like a suggestion and more like an order, and the way he had said it with that unsettling emphasis sent a wave of unease through her. What did Thorne know about the sarcophagus? More than he was letting on, that was for sure. And what was the Osiris Foundation really up to? They claimed to be interested in containing the situation, in maintaining discretion. But their actions spoke of something else entirely: control, suppression, and a disturbing level of pre-existing knowledge about the events unfolding in the museum. Dr. Hayes sank into her chair, the silence of her office feeling heavy and oppressive. She felt a growing sense of isolation, of being cut off from her own research, from her own understanding of the situation. Thorne had taken her notes, restricted access to the exhibit, and effectively silenced her voice within the museum. But he hadn't taken her knowledge, her instincts, her growing suspicion. And he certainly hadn't quelled her determination to uncover the truth. As she sat there, staring at the empty space on her desk where her research notes had been, a new resolve began to solidify within her. Thorne and the Osiris Foundation might think they could control her, control the narrative, control the museum itself. But they were wrong. She would not be silenced. She would not be intimidated. She would find a way to investigate, to uncover the truth behind the rituals, the spectral figures, the sarcophagus, and the Osiris Foundation's true motives. She would do it discreetly, carefully, but she would do it. She owed it to the museum, to the staff, and to herself. and she had a growing suspicion that the answers she sought were not just buried in ancient texts and artifacts, but also within the enigmatic figure of Mr. Silas Thorne himself. His carefully constructed facade, his unsettling smile, his veiled pronouncements, they all hinted at a deeper, darker knowledge, a secret he was desperate to protect. And Dr. Hayes was determined to uncover that secret, no matter the cost. The confiscation of her notes, the restrictions, Thorne's veiled threats, they had not deterred her. They had ignited a fire within her, a burning need to understand, to expose, to protect the museum from whatever ancient power the Osiris Foundation seemed to be both aware of and, disturbingly, complicit in. Her investigation had just begun. Confiscation of her notes, restrictions, Thorne's veiled threats, they had not deterred her. They had ignited a fire within her, a burning need to understand, to expose, to protect the museum from whatever ancient power the Osiris Foundation seemed to be both aware of and, disturbingly, complicit in. Her investigation had just begun. Evelyn knew she couldn't operate within the museum itself anymore, not openly. Thorne had effectively shut her down, and Olsen, while now seemingly convinced of the reality of the events, was also clearly under pressure from the Foundation representative. She needed to work in the shadows, relying on her own resources and ingenuity. Her first priority was to reconstruct her research, to recall as much as possible from the notes Thorne had taken. Thankfully, she had a good memory, honed by years of academic study and meticulous observation. She spent the rest of the day ostensibly cataloging routine artifacts in a different section of the museum, but in reality, mentally revisiting her notes, reconstructing the key passages, the critical symbols, the emerging patterns she had identified. That evening, Evelyn returned to her apartment, the city lights twinkling below her window like distant stars. The urban hum, usually a comforting background noise, felt strangely oppressive tonight, a constant reminder of the vast, indifferent world outside the museum walls, a world oblivious to the ancient forces stirring within. She needed a sanctuary, a space where she could think, research, and plan, away from the museum's watchful eyes and Thorne's pervasive influence. Her thoughts turned to the museum's library. Officially, it was closed to staff after hours, but Evelyn, as curator, had access, and she knew of a small, rarely used reading room tucked away in the archives section, a forgotten space filled with dusty tomes and forgotten histories. It was risky, but it was her best option. Late that night, under the cloak of darkness, Evelyn slipped back into the museum. The security was tighter now, Olsen's instructions clearly implemented. Extra guards patrolled the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. She moved stealthily, relying on her intimate knowledge of the museum's layout, navigating through the darkened halls like a shadow herself. She reached the library, its heavy oak doors looming before her like the entrance to a forgotten tomb. Using her curator's key, she gained access, stepping into the cavernous space, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and leather. The main reading room was dark and silent, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the high-arched windows. She made her way to the archives section, a labyrinth of narrow aisles lined with towering shelves, the silence even more profound here, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. She found the hidden reading room, a small, almost claustrophobic space tucked away behind a row of oversized atlases. It was dimly lit by a single dusty lamp, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls lined with ancient books. It was perfect, hidden, secluded, and filled with the very resources she needed. She settled into a worn leather chair, the scent of old books enveloping her like a comforting embrace. Her mission now was to find more information, to delve deeper into the ancient texts, to uncover the secrets of the rituals and the entity they were meant to summon. She started with the museum's extensive collection of Egyptology texts, pulling down volumes on ancient Egyptian mythology, funerary rituals, and magical practices. Hours passed in a blur of frantic research. She scanned through page after page, searching for any mention of prophecies, of awakenings, of entities connected to lunar cycles and rituals within museum settings. Frustration mounted as she found nothing directly relevant. The texts were rich with detail about gods and goddesses, spells and incantations, but nothing that specifically matched the events unfolding in the Grand Alexandria. She felt a growing sense of despair, of chasing shadows in the vast darkness of ancient history. Just as she was about to succumb to exhaustion, her eye caught a title on a particularly ancient-looking volume tucked away on a lower shelf. The Book of Amun-Ra, Hidden Lore and Forbidden Prophecies. The title itself sent a shiver down her spine. Forbidden Prophecies, Hidden Lore. It sounded almost too on the nose, too conveniently aligned with her current predicament. But desperation drove her, and she pulled the heavy volume from the shelf. Its leather cover cracked and brittle with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. Carefully she opened the book, its pages rustling like ancient whispers. The script was archaic, a form of hieratic writing she recognized as dating back to the early dynasties. It was dense, complex, and difficult to decipher, but Evelyn, with her years of training, could make out the basic glyphs, slowly piecing together the ancient words. As she translated, a passage began to emerge, a section marked with elaborate illustrations depicting celestial alignments and shadowy figures performing rituals under the light of a full moon. Her heart began to pound as she realized what she was reading. It was a prophecy foretelling the reawakening of an ancient entity, and it was terrifyingly specific. The prophecy spoke of a time of lunar convergence, when the celestial spheres would align under the gaze of the full moon, amplifying ancient energies and weakening the veil between worlds. During this time, it warned, rituals performed with artifacts of power within a house of echoes, which Evelyn interpreted as a museum, a place filled with echoes of the past, could awaken a dormant entity, a being of immense power and ancient chaos, known only as the Devourer of Light. The prophecy described the Devourer as a being of shadow and hunger, an entity that craved life force and thrived on chaos, its reawakening bringing about a time of unending darkness and the collapse of the ordered world. The rituals described in the text eerily mirrored the events unfolding in the museum, the arrangement of artifacts, the scent of incense, the chanting, even the spectral figures described in the prophecy as shadow servitors sent to prepare the way for the Devourer's return. The prophecy explicitly warned of dire consequences if the rituals were completed under the full moon. It spoke of a consuming darkness that would engulf the city, then the world, unleashing chaos and destruction on an unimaginable scale. It offered a glimmer of hope, however, a cryptic passage suggesting that the reawakening could be averted, but only if the rituals were disrupted before the lunar apex, the precise moment of the full moon's zenith. The text was vague on how to disrupt the rituals, offering only cryptic clues and symbolic riddles, hinting at the need for pure heart, ancient knowledge, and a sacrifice of self. Evelyn finished translating the prophecy, her hands trembling, her mind reeling from the weight of its ominous pronouncements. The Devourer of Light, a being of shadow and hunger, reawakening under the full moon, dire consequences. It was all terrifyingly coherent, chillingly aligned with the escalating events in the museum. The prophecy was not just some ancient myth or superstitious tale. It felt real, immediate, a terrifyingly plausible explanation for the impossible phenomena she had witnessed. The full moon, it was in 2 days. The lunar apex was rapidly approaching. Time was running out. She knew she had to warn Olsen, to share this terrifying discovery, to convince him of the imminent danger. But Olsen was increasingly distant, his interactions with her becoming more formal, more constrained. Thorne's influence was palpable, a silent wall erected between them. She found Olsen in his office the next morning, the security footage from the Hall of Dynasties flickering on the monitors, the ghostly figures now more defined, more active, their movements almost purposeful. Olsen looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed with worry, but there was also a new rigidity in his posture, a subtle shift in his demeanor that made Evelyn uneasy. "Captain Olsen," she began, her voice urgent, "I need to talk to you. It's important." Olsen looked up, his gaze guarded. "Dr. Hayes, yes, is there another anomaly to report?" His tone was clipped, almost dismissive, a stark contrast to his earlier openness and concern. "It's more than anomalies, Captain," Evelyn insisted, stepping closer to his desk. "I've found something significant. I was researching in the library last night and I found a prophecy, an ancient Egyptian prophecy, and it describes exactly what's happening here in the museum." Olsen's brow furrowed, his skepticism immediately resurfacing. "A prophecy, Dr. Hayes. With all due respect, we're dealing with a potential security crisis, not ancient folklore. Captain, please just listen, Evelyn pleaded, her voice trembling with urgency. This isn't just folklore. This prophecy describes the reawakening of an ancient entity, a being called the Devourer of Light. It says this reawakening will happen during the next full moon, triggered by rituals performed with artifacts of power in a house of echoes, which I believe is this museum. Olson remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the monitors, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Dr. Hayes, I appreciate your research, but Mr. Thorne has assured me that the Osiris Foundation is handling the situation. They have experts, resources, they're taking all necessary precautions. Evelyn's heart sank. Thorne had gotten to him. Olson, once her skeptical but reliable ally, was now echoing Thorne's dismissive pronouncements, his skepticism now seemingly directed at her, not at the impossible events unfolding around them. Precautions, Captain, Evelyn exclaimed, her voice rising in frustration. Restricting access, confiscating research notes, silencing staff, is that what you call precautions? This prophecy warns of dire consequences, Captain, of unending darkness and the collapse of the ordered world if these rituals are completed. We can't just stand by and let the Osiris Foundation handle it, especially when they seem to be more interested in covering it up than stopping it. Olson's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. Dr. Hayes, I understand you're concerned, but I need you to trust that the Osiris Foundation knows what they're doing. They've dealt with these kinds of situations before. He repeated Thorne's words almost verbatim, his voice devoid of his usual gruff sincerity. Mr. Thorne has assured me that there is no cause for alarm. He's asked us to maintain order, to ensure the safety of the museum and its staff, and to follow his instructions. And that's what we're going to do. Evelyn stared at him, a wave of despair washing over her. Olson was lost, completely under Thorne's influence. His skepticism, once a barrier against superstition, had now become a tool of denial, blinding him to the very real danger they faced. Captain, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, don't you see? Thorne doesn't want to stop it, he wants to control it. The Osiris Foundation is involved in this somehow. They're not trying to prevent the reawakening, they're facilitating it. Olson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his expression now openly hostile. Dr. Hayes, I'm going to have to ask you to stop. This conspiracy theory is not helping. Mr. Thorne is here to help us, to guide us through this difficult time. He's asked for our cooperation, and I expect you to cooperate as well. Understood. Evelyn stared at him, speechless, the weight of his betrayal crushing her. Olson, her ally, her colleague, had turned against her, blinded by Thorne's smooth pronouncements and the Osiris Foundation's power. She was alone, facing an ancient evil, a powerful corporation, and a museum staff increasingly swayed by fear and misinformation. The full moon was approaching. The rituals were escalating, and the only person who had initially believed her was now lost to the influence of the very forces she was trying to fight. Her warning had failed. Olson was no longer an ally but an obstacle. She was on her own, but she wouldn't give up. The prophecy, the devourer of light, the impending darkness, it was all too real, too terrifying to ignore. She had to find another way, a secret path to uncover the truth and stop the reawakening before it was too late for the museum, for the city, for the world. Her clandestine investigation, now more urgent than ever, had to continue, even if she had to face the darkness alone. Evelyn left Olson's office, a profound sense of isolation settling upon her like a shroud. The weight of the prophecy, the chilling pronouncements of the Book of Amun-Ra, now felt almost unbearable, compounded by the realization that her most crucial ally had been compromised. She was adrift in a sea of denial and deception, surrounded by forces both ancient and modern, all converging upon the museum, all threatening to unleash something unimaginable. She couldn't afford to despair. The prophecy spoke of disruption, of averting the reawakening. Hope, however faint, still flickered. But to act, she needed information. She needed to understand the cult, their methods, their goals, and their connection to the Osiris Foundation. She needed to find a weakness, an angle of attack, and she needed to do it quickly. Her mind raced, considering her options. She was restricted from the ancient Egypt exhibit. Thorne had her research notes, and Olson was no longer trustworthy. But she still had access to other parts of the museum, to the staff, and to her own knowledge. She decided to focus on the cult, to try and understand their operation within the city. Whispers of a cult had circulated among the staff, vague rumors of a charismatic leader known as the Initiate. Perhaps uncovering more about this cult was the key. She started discreetly, approaching staff members she trusted, those who had expressed unease about the recent events, those who seemed less swayed by Thorne's reassurances. Mrs. Davison, with her years of experience and keen intuition, was a natural first point of contact. Evelyn found her dusting display cases in the hall of Ptolemaic Egypt, her brow furrowed with concern. "Mrs. Davison," Evelyn began, her voice low and conspiratorial, "I wanted to ask you something about the rumors, about a cult operating in the city." Mrs. Davison's eyes widened slightly, her dusting cloth pausing midair. She glanced around nervously, then leaned closer to Evelyn, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Initiates flock dear. Yes, whispers have been going around for years. They say they're ancient, you know. Been here in Alexandria for centuries, hiding in the shadows, waiting for their time." "Do you know anything more about them?" Evelyn pressed, her heart quickening. "Their beliefs, their activities." Mrs. Davison shook her head slowly. "Just whispers, dear. They say the Initiate is very charismatic, drawn many to their fold from all walks of life. Some say they hold secret meetings in the old parts of the city and the catacombs beneath." She paused, her eyes widening further. "And some say they've infiltrated the museum, that they have people here on the inside." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. Infiltration, it made chilling sense. The subtle sabotage, the escalating rituals, the seemingly impossible events, could it all be orchestrated by a cult operating within the museum's very walls? "Do you know anyone who might be connected to this cult?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Davison hesitated, her gaze darting around the hall again. Then she leaned even closer, her voice dropping to a mere breath. There's young Ben Carter, dear, the new security guard. He's a quiet one, keeps to himself, but I've seen him. Sometimes after hours, lingering in the Hall of Dynasties, more than just patrol, I think, and he's been asking questions about the ancient artifacts, about rituals, about curses." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "And he seems different lately. More intense, almost zealous. Ben Carter, the security guard who had reported seeing the ghostly figures. The one Olsen had initially dismissed, but whose account had been chillingly corroborated by the security footage. Could he be connected to the cult? It seemed improbable, yet Mrs. Davison's intuition was rarely wrong, and the pieces were starting to fit together, forming a disturbing picture. Evelyn thanked Mrs. Davison, her mind racing. She needed to observe Ben Carter to find out more about his activities, his possible connection to the cult, but she had to be careful. Thorne's eyes and Olsen's were likely watching her. She needed to operate discreetly, to move like a shadow in the shadows. Over the next few days, Evelyn subtly observed Ben Carter. She noticed him lingering near the Hall of Dynasties, as Mrs. Davison had suggested, his gaze fixed on the artifacts, a strange intensity in his eyes. She saw him speaking in hushed tones with other staff members, his words inaudible but his demeanor urgent, almost persuasive. And she noticed something else, something chillingly significant. Small acts of sabotage were escalating within the museum. Security cameras in the Hall of Dynasties malfunctioned intermittently, their feeds flickering and cutting out at crucial moments. Display case locks were mysteriously jammed, requiring extra time and effort to open and close. And most disturbingly, artifacts were disappearing. Not grand, dramatic thefts, but subtle, almost imperceptible removals. Small amulets, minor offering vessels, insignificant-looking fragments of pottery, items that might easily be overlooked, dismissed as misplaced or accidentally broken. But Evelyn, with her meticulous knowledge of the collection, noticed the discrepancies. The canopic jar that had been moved was now gone, replaced by a replica so convincing only a trained eye could detect the substitution. The offering bowl, overturned and scattered, was missing several of the replica dates and figs, replaced by ordinary dates and figs from the museum cafe, a blatant, almost mocking substitution. And the dark feather, the inexplicable object she had found near the overturned offering bowl, was also gone. The artifacts were not just moving, they were being stolen, replaced, manipulated. And the sabotage of the security systems suggested a coordinated effort, an inside job. The cult, it seemed, was indeed operating within the museum, and their activities were escalating rapidly, mirroring the intensifying rituals described in the prophecy. They were preparing the way for the devourer of light, systematically weakening the museum's defenses, both physical and spiritual, paving the path for the reawakening. Evelyn knew she had to act decisively, to find concrete proof of the cult's activities and their connection to the Osiris Foundation. She needed to infiltrate their operations, to uncover their plans, and to find a way to disrupt the rituals before the full moon. Her thoughts returned to the museum basement, the labyrinthine network of storage rooms, maintenance tunnels, and forgotten spaces beneath the grand halls. Mrs. Davison had mentioned rumors of secret meetings in the catacombs beneath the city. Could the museum basement be connected to these catacombs? Could the cult be operating from within the museum's underbelly, hidden from view, conducting their rituals in the shadows? The basement was a vast, largely unexplored territory, a maze of dimly lit corridors and cavernous rooms, filled with forgotten artifacts, discarded exhibits, and the museum's less glamorous infrastructure, boilers, generators, ventilation systems. Evelyn rarely ventured into the basement, finding it damp, claustrophobic, and unsettlingly labyrinthine. But now it beckoned, a potential gateway into the heart of the mystery, a hidden realm where the cult might be operating unseen. Late one night after the museum had closed and the staff had departed, Evelyn made her way to the basement. Security was tighter even in the non-exhibit areas, but Evelyn, now practiced in stealth, managed to evade patrols, slipping through darkened corridors and service entrances, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She reached the basement access point, a heavy steel door hidden behind a tapestry in a rarely visited storage room. Using her curator's master key, she unlocked the door, stepping into the dimly lit stairwell leading down into the museum's underbelly. The air in the basement was immediately different, colder, damper, heavier, imbued with a musty, earthy scent that spoke of age and decay. The silence was deeper here, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the occasional drip of water. Evelyn descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness, her flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. She reached the basement level, stepping into a long, dimly lit corridor lined with storage rooms, their heavy steel doors casting long, distorted shadows. The air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew, a sense of forgotten history clinging to every corner. She moved cautiously, her flashlight beam sweeping across the corridor, her senses on high alert. She needed to find a sign, a clue, anything that would indicate the cult's presence in the basement. She checked storage rooms, peering through dusty windows, finding only rows of forgotten display cases, stacks of discarded crates, and piles of dusty artifacts awaiting cataloging or restoration. She explored maintenance tunnels, narrow, claustrophobic passages filled with pipes and wires, the air thick with the smell of oil and damp concrete. She found nothing, no sign of recent activity, no hint of a secret ritual chamber. Frustration began to gnaw at her, a fear that she was chasing another phantom, that the cult was operating elsewhere beyond her reach. Just as she was about to give up, to retreat back to the surface and rethink her strategy, she noticed something. A faint scent, almost imperceptible amidst the musty basement air, but undeniably there, incense. The same heavy, cloying scent of myrrh and frankincense that had been permeating the Hall of Dynasties, but stronger here, more concentrated, almost overpowering. The scent was faint, but it led her onward, a thread of ancient aroma guiding her deeper into the basement labyrinth. She followed the scent, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, her heart pounding with renewed hope. The scent led her down another corridor, deeper into the bowels of the museum, past more storage rooms and maintenance areas, the air growing colder, damper, the silence more profound. Finally, the corridor opened into a larger chamber, a vast, cavernous space dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights, the air thick with the overpowering scent of incense. And in the center of the chamber, illuminated by the flickering lights and the eerie glow of several strategically placed candles, she saw it. The ritual. A circle of figures cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden in shadow, stood around a makeshift altar constructed from crates and draped with black cloth. On the altar lay several artifacts, small amulets, offering vessels, fragments of pottery, items eerily similar to those that had been disappearing from the Hall of Dynasties. In the center of the altar, amidst the artifacts, was a small, dark feather, identical to the one she had found near the overturned offering bowl, now pulsing with a faint, ethereal glow. The figures chanted in a low, rhythmic monotone, a language she didn't understand, yet somehow recognized as ancient, primal, the same chilling chanting from her nightmares. The air was thick with smoke from the incense, swirling around the figures, obscuring their forms, imbuing the chamber with an otherworldly atmosphere. At the head of the altar stood a figure slightly taller than the rest, their robes more elaborate, adorned with intricate symbols and a hooded mask obscuring their face entirely. This figure, Evelyn realized with a chilling certainty, must be the initiate. Their movements were deliberate, commanding, their chanting louder, more resonant, the focal point of the ritual. As Evelyn watched, hidden in the shadows at the edge of the chamber, the initiate raised their hands, holding aloft a small obsidian knife, its surface gleaming ominously in the candlelight. The chanting intensified, reaching a fever pitch, the air vibrating with unseen energy. The obsidian knife glinted in the dim light, poised above the altar, above the artifacts, above the pulsing dark feather. Evelyn realized with a chilling certainty that she was witnessing a sacrifice, a ritualistic offering meant to fuel the reawakening, to empower the devourer of light. And the full moon, she knew, was only hours away. The lunar apex was rapidly approaching. The ritual was reaching its climax, and she, Evelyn Hayes, was the only one who knew, the only one who could stop it. But how? Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and trapped in the shadows, she was a lone woman against an ancient cult and a rising tide of darkness. The weight of the prophecy, the fate of the museum, perhaps even the world, rested on her shoulders. And the obsidian knife, poised above the altar, glinted ominously in the flickering candlelight, a silent promise of sacrifice, a chilling countdown to the unleashing of unimaginable darkness. Evelyn stood paralyzed in the shadows, the scene before her a horrifying confirmation of her deepest fears. The chanting, the incense, the cloaked figures, it was all real, all undeniably ritualistic. The obsidian knife, glinting ominously, seemed to pulse with a dark energy, mirroring the faint glow of the feather on the altar. A wave of nausea washed over her, a sickening blend of fear and dread. This wasn't just museum mischief. This was a deliberate, orchestrated attempt to unleash something ancient and terrible. She had to do something, but what? She was alone, unarmed, and facing a group of fanatical cultists led by a figure radiating an unnerving sense of power. Direct confrontation was suicide. Calling for help seemed impossible. Olsen was compromised, Thorne was likely involved, and who else could she trust? Her mind raced, desperately searching for a plan, a strategy, any way to disrupt the ritual, to avert the impending disaster. As she frantically scanned the chamber, her eyes caught on a small, flickering light source beyond the circle of chanting figures, tucked away in a shadowed alcove at the far end of the chamber. It was a security panel, its access door slightly ajar, a faint green glow emanating from within. An idea, desperate but potentially viable, sparked in her mind. The museum's security systems, they were designed to protect the artifacts, to maintain order, to prevent chaos. Could they be turned against the cult? Could she trigger an alarm, a lockdown, anything to disrupt the ritual and alert outside help, even if that help was initially skeptical? It was a long shot, but it was the only option she could see. Moving with extreme caution, she began to edge her way around the perimeter of the chamber, staying close to the walls, using the shadows as her cover. The chanting continued, a hypnotic drone that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the museum. The initiate's obsidian knife remained poised above the altar, a silent threat hanging in the air. Evelyn moved slowly, painstakingly, her breath held, her heart pounding in her ears, each step a gamble, each shadow a potential hiding place or a lurking danger. As she neared the alcove with the security panel, a sudden sound pierced the hypnotic chanting, a low, insistent buzzing emanating from her pocket, her phone. She had forgotten to silence it. Panic seized her. The chanting faltered, the cloaked figures stiffening, turning their hooded heads towards the direction of the sound. The initiate lowered the obsidian knife, their masked face turning towards the shadows where Evelyn was hidden, an unnerving stillness radiating from their form. Evelyn froze, caught in the harsh glare of the flickering candlelight, exposed, vulnerable. She knew she had been discovered, Escape was impossible. Confrontation was inevitable. But as the cloaked figures began to move towards her, a voice, low and urgent, whispered from the shadows behind her. "Dr. Hayes, is that you?" Evelyn spun around, her heart leaping. Standing in the deeper shadows of the alcove, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure in a museum security uniform. It was David, one of the guards she had seen on patrol, a young man with a quiet, observant demeanor, someone she had exchanged polite greetings with but never truly spoken to. "David," she whispered back, relief flooding through her, mixed with confusion. What was he doing here? "Keep your voice down," David hissed, stepping further into the shadows, pulling her deeper into the alcove with him. "They're getting closer." He glanced back towards the chanting figures who were now slowly advancing towards the alcove, their movements deliberate, menacing. "We need to get out of here." "But what are you doing here?" Evelyn asked, her mind still reeling from the sudden turn of events. "How did you know I was here?" "I've been watching them," David explained, his voice low and urgent. "For days, something's been off. The security cameras flickering, artifacts disappearing, the incense smell getting stronger. And then I saw Ben Carter, slipping down here late at night. I followed him, and then I saw them, the rituals." He shuddered, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "I tried to tell Captain Olson, but he wouldn't listen. He's changed since Thorne arrived." Evelyn's mind raced. David, a sympathetic security guard who had also noticed the anomalies, who had also suspected the cult, and Olson compromised under Thorne's influence. It was all falling into place, a terrifyingly coherent picture of manipulation and betrayal. "David, you're right," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. He's not himself, and Thorne is not who he seems. He's part of this somehow. I think he's involved with the cult." David's eyes widened further. "Thorne, but he's from the Osiris Foundation. He's supposed to be helping us." "No, David, he's not," Evelyn said urgently. "I've discovered something in ancient prophecy. It speaks of a reawakening of an entity called the Devourer of Light. And these rituals, they're meant to summon it. And Thorne, I think he's not trying to stop it, he's trying to control it." David stared at her, his face pale in the dim light. "Control it, but why?" "I don't know for sure," Evelyn admitted, her voice low. "But I suspect the Osiris Foundation is not what it seems. I think there are factions within it, rival groups vying for power. And I think Thorne is part of one of those factions, and he wants to control this entity, this Devourer of Light, for his own purposes." The prophecy, the rituals, Thorne's enigmatic pronouncements, Olson's sudden change in demeanor. It all pointed towards a larger conspiracy, a power struggle playing out within the museum, with ancient forces as the ultimate prize. But what can we do?" David asked, his voice filled with desperation. "They're coming, we're trapped." The cloaked figures were now just a few feet away, their chanting resuming, their masked faces looming closer, their movements predatory. Evelyn's mind raced, desperately searching for an answer. The security panel, it was still her only hope. "David, can you get to that security panel?" she whispered, pointing towards the alcove wall. "Can you trigger an alarm, a lockdown, anything to disrupt the ritual?" David glanced towards the panel, then back at the approaching figures, his face etched with fear and determination. "I can try," he said, his voice barely audible, "but they'll see me." "We don't have a choice," Evelyn said urgently. "It's our only chance. Go now, I'll try to distract them." It was a desperate gamble, a sacrificial move, but she had to buy David time, to give him a chance to activate the alarm, to alert anyone, to the unfolding crisis. David nodded, his face grim. "Be careful, Dr. Hayes," he whispered, then darted out of the shadows, moving towards the security panel with surprising speed and agility. Evelyn stepped out of the alcove into the flickering candlelight, drawing the attention of the approaching figures. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the cavernous chamber. "Stop this ritual, you don't know what you're unleashing." The chanting faltered again, the cloaked figures turning their attention to her, their masked faces now fully visible, their eyes gleaming with a fanatical intensity. The initiate stepped forward, their masked face turning towards her, an unnerving silence radiating from their form. They raised a hand, gesturing towards the other figures, and they began to advance towards Evelyn, their movements no longer hesitant but swift, purposeful, menacing. Evelyn stood her ground, her heart pounding, her voice trembling but resolute. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber. "This entity, this devourer of light, it will destroy you all. It will consume everything." The initiate remained silent, their masked face impassive, their hands still raised, directing the advance of their followers. The cloaked figures closed in, their chanting growing louder, more aggressive, their eyes fixed on her, their movements predatory. Evelyn knew she was outmatched, outnumbered, facing a group of fanatics driven by blind faith and ancient delusion. But she had to buy David time. She had to distract them, to delay them, to give him a chance to trigger the alarm, to alert the world to the impending darkness. She braced herself for the inevitable, ready to face the consequences of her defiance, ready to sacrifice herself, if necessary, to stop the ritual, to avert the reawakening, to save the museum, the city, perhaps even the world. Suddenly a piercing shriek echoed through the chamber, cutting through the chanting, silencing the advancing figures. It was the security alarm, blaring loudly, insistently, filling the basement with its jarring, disruptive sound. David, he had done it. He had triggered the alarm. The cloaked figures froze, their movements faltering, their masked faces turning towards the security panel, their eyes wide with shock and anger. The initiate whirled around, their masked face turning towards the alcove, their obsidian knife raised high, their form radiating a palpable fury. In that moment of chaos and confusion, Evelyn saw her chance. She darted forward towards the altar, towards the pulsing dark feather, her mind focused on disrupting the ritual, on severing the connection, on stopping the reawakening. But as she moved, a figure lunged out of the shadows, intercepting her, blocking her path. It was Ben Carter, his face contorted with rage, his eyes burning with fanatical zeal. "You cannot stop us," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "The awakening is at hand. The devourer will rise." He lunged at Evelyn, his hands outstretched, his eyes filled with a terrifying intensity. Evelyn recoiled, dodging his attack, narrowly avoiding his grasp. He was stronger than he looked, his movements fueled by a fanatical energy, his eyes fixed on her with a chilling determination. She was trapped, caught between Carter and the advancing cloaked figures, the security alarm blaring around her, the obsidian knife glinting ominously in the initiate's hand, the pulsing dark feather vibrating with unseen power on the altar. The basement chamber had become a chaotic vortex of fear, fanaticism, and impending doom. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed through the chamber, followed by a blinding flash of light. The fluorescent lights flickered and died, plunging the chamber into near darkness, illuminated only by the flickering candles and the eerie glow of the feather. The security alarm abruptly cut off, replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the cloaked figures and the frantic pounding of Evelyn's heart. Chaos erupted. The cloaked figures scattered, their chanting replaced by panicked shouts and frantic movements. The initiate roared, a sound of pure rage and frustration, their obsidian knife slashing wildly in the darkness. Evelyn stumbled back, blinded by the flash, disoriented by the sudden darkness and silence. She could hear shouts, scuffling, the sounds of bodies colliding in the darkness. She felt a hand grab her arm, pulling her roughly, dragging her through the chaotic darkness. "This way," a voice hissed in her ear. It was David. He had somehow managed to escape the cloaked figures, to find her in the darkness, to pull her away from the chaos. He dragged her through the darkness, away from the ritual chamber, through the maze of basement corridors, his grip tight, his movements urgent. They stumbled through the darkness, guided only by David's knowledge of the basement layout and the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, replaced by the oppressive silence of the basement, broken only by their ragged breathing and the echoing thump of their footsteps. Finally, they reached the basement access stairs, climbing back towards the upper levels of the museum, leaving the chaotic darkness of the ritual chamber behind. As they emerged back into the dimly lit corridors of the museum's main level, the silence was broken again, this time by the frantic crackle of a security radio. "Security breach in the basement, Hall of Dynasties exhibit, all units respond." It was Olsen's voice, strained, urgent, almost panicked. "Code red, code red." Evelyn and David exchanged a look of grim relief. The alarm had worked. Olsen, or at least his security team, was responding. But as they started to move towards the main lobby, towards the approaching sounds of running footsteps and frantic radio chatter, A sudden barrage of gunfire erupted from behind them, echoing through the museum halls. Screams followed, cut short abruptly. Then silence again, a chilling, ominous silence. David grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her back into the shadows. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice filled with terror. "Thorne's men, they're here, Thorne's men. Not just the cult, but a professional security force, armed, ruthless, and clearly under Thorne's command." The Osiris Foundation was not just involved, they were actively suppressing any resistance, any attempt to stop the ritual, any exposure of their true agenda. Another burst of gunfire echoed through the halls, closer now, followed by more screams, more silence. David pulled Evelyn deeper into the shadows, towards a side corridor, away from the approaching sounds of gunfire and the frantic radio chatter. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not safe. Thorne, he's going to kill anyone who gets in his way." They moved stealthily through the side corridors, avoiding the main halls, the sounds of gunfire and screams still echoing behind them, a terrifying reminder of the chaos and violence unleashed within the museum. As they reached a less frequented corridor leading towards a staff exit, David suddenly stopped, his hand going to his side, his face contorting in pain. "I've been hit," he gasped, his voice weak. "In the basement during the chaos." Evelyn looked down, her heart sinking. David's uniform was stained with blood, a dark crimson spreading rapidly across his side. He had been injured in the basement during the confrontation with the cultists, and she hadn't even noticed, too focused on her own fear and the urgency of their escape. "David, no," she cried, her voice filled with anguish. "We need to get you help." "No time," David gasped, his breathing shallow, his face pale. "Listen, Thorne, it's not just about control, it's about power. He wants to become a god, to merge with the Devourer, to rule the world." His voice faded, his eyes glazing over with pain. "The Osiris Foundation, factions, rival groups, Thorne's faction, wants the power, the Devourer's power." He reached into his pocket, his hand trembling, pulling out a small USB drive stained with his blood. "Take this," he gasped, pressing the drive into Evelyn's hand. "Evidence, Thorne's plans, his agenda, rival faction, inside information." His voice faded again, his grip weakening. "Stop him, Dr. Hayes, stop Thorne before it's too late." His eyes closed, his body slumping against the wall, his breathing ceasing altogether. David was gone, sacrificed, a casualty in a battle against ancient darkness and modern ambition. Evelyn stared down at his lifeless face, tears streaming down her cheeks, a wave of grief and guilt washing over her. David, the sympathetic security guard who had risked his life to help her to expose the truth, to stop Thorne, was dead. Killed by Thorne's men, silenced forever. But he had not died in vain. He had given her something precious, something crucial, the USB drive, evidence of Thorne's true agenda, proof of the rival faction within the Osiris Foundation, inside information that could expose Thorne and his sinister plan. David's sacrifice had not been in vain. He had given her the weapon she needed to fight back, to avenge his death, to stop Thorne, to avert the reawakening, to save the world from the Devourer of light. Clutching the blood-stained USB drive tightly in her hand, Evelyn knew what she had to do. She had to escape the museum, to expose Thorne's treachery, to find a way to use David's information to disrupt the ritual, to stop the Devourer from rising. She would not let David's sacrifice be for nothing. She would fight for him, for the museum, for the city, for humanity itself. The full moon was approaching. The countdown to the lunar apex was ticking relentlessly onwards, and Evelyn, armed with David's sacrifice and a burning resolve, was ready to face the darkness, to confront Thorne, to fight for the light. Her solitary battle, now fueled by grief and vengeance, had just begun, and the fate of the world hung in the balance. Clutching David's blood-stained USB drive, Evelyn fled the museum, the echoing gunshots and chilling silence propelling her forward. She navigated the deserted back corridors, her mind a whirlwind of grief, fear, and a burning resolve. David's sacrifice had bought her time and information, but the cost was immense, a stark reminder of the deadly stakes. Thorne was not just a shadowy representative of a secretive foundation. He was a ruthless power seeker, willing to kill to achieve his godlike ambitions. Emerging from a staff exit into the cool night air, Evelyn paused, gasping for breath, the city lights a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the museum basement. The USB drive felt heavy in her hand, a tangible weight of responsibility. She had to find a way to use it to expose Thorn, to stop the ritual, and to avenge David's death. But first, she needed to get to safety, to process the information, and to formulate a plan. She hailed a taxi, giving her home address, her gaze fixed on the museum's imposing silhouette receding in the distance. The image of David's lifeless face, the glint of the obsidian knife, the chanting figures, and the echoing gunshots flashed through her mind, a terrifying montage of the night's horrors. She felt a cold dread creeping into her bones, a sense of being hunted, of being constantly watched. Thorn's reach was vast, his resources unlimited. She was no longer just an academic, a curator. She was a fugitive, a target, caught in a dangerous game she barely understood. Reaching her apartment, Evelyn locked the door behind her, the familiar surroundings offering a small measure of comfort, a temporary sanctuary from the chaos. But even within her own walls, she felt exposed, vulnerable. She knew Thorn's men could be anywhere, watching, waiting. She needed to be careful, to trust no one, to operate completely in the shadows. First, the USB drive. She retrieved her laptop, her hands trembling slightly as she inserted the drive. The files loaded quickly, revealing a complex structure of documents, images, and encrypted data. Evelyn began to navigate through the files, her heart pounding with anticipation. David's inside information was starting to unfold before her eyes. The documents were a mix of internal Osiris Foundation memos, encrypted communications, and detailed plans, all pointing towards Thorn's clandestine operations and his faction's agenda. There were financial records detailing suspicious transfers, coded messages hinting at rival factions within the Foundation, and chillingly explicit ritualistic preparations. Images showed Thorn meeting with shadowy figures in clandestine locations, ancient texts annotated with disturbing interpretations, and diagrams depicting the sarcophagus as a focal point of immense power. As she delved deeper, Thorn's plan began to crystallize, becoming even more terrifying than she had imagined. He wasn't just seeking control, he was seeking apotheosis, emerging with the Devourer of Light to achieve godhood, to reshape the world in his own twisted image. The rituals were not just summoning rituals, they were transformation rituals, designed to channel the Devourer's power into Thorn, to elevate him to a being of unimaginable power. And the full moon, the lunar apex, was the critical moment, the point of convergence when the celestial energies would be at their peak, when the veil between worlds would be thinnest, when Thorn's transformation would be complete. The files also revealed the existence of a rival faction within the Osiris Foundation, a group opposed to Thorn's methods and his ultimate goals. They were identified in the documents as the Keepers, a more traditionalist faction, dedicated to preserving ancient knowledge and artifacts, not exploiting them for personal gain or unleashing dangerous entities upon the world. The Keepers were aware of Thorn's activities, but they lacked the resources and the influence to stop him directly. David, it seemed, was working with the Keepers, gathering evidence to expose Thorn and his faction, to prevent the reawakening, to protect the world from the Devourer. Evelyn realized with a surge of hope that she wasn't entirely alone. The Keepers existed, they were out there, and David had given her the key to contact them, to join forces to fight back against Thorn and his cult. Among the files, she found an encrypted contact, a secure communication channel, a way to reach out to the Keepers, to share David's evidence, to seek their help. Time was running out. The full moon was hours away. Thorn was in the museum, likely proceeding with the final stages of the ritual. Olsen and the museum security team were likely either compromised or eliminated. She was alone, hunted, but armed with David's evidence and the hope of finding allies in the Keepers. She had to act quickly, decisively, to disrupt Thorn's plan, to stop the ritual, to prevent the Devourer from rising. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn opened the secure communication channel on her laptop, her fingers trembling as she typed a message, a desperate plea for help, a beacon in the darkness. "This is Dr. Evelyn Hayes," she typed, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke the words aloud, confirming her identity. "I have evidence of Thorn's treachery. I need to contact the Keepers. The ritual is underway. The full moon is approaching. We are running out of time." She hit send, her heart pounding, her fate now hanging in the balance. Dependent on the response from an unknown, unseen faction, her last hope against the rising darkness. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence of her apartment amplifying the tension, the city lights outside mocking her isolation. Then a faint chime from her laptop, a notification of an incoming message. Her breath hitched, her fingers hovering over the trackpad, hesitant, fearful, yet desperate for connection. She opened the message. It was short, cryptic, but undeniably a response. The owl watches, meet at the crossroads, midnight. The owl watches, the crossroads, cryptic code words, but undeniably a confirmation. The keepers had received her message. They were responding. Hope surged through Evelyn, a fragile spark in the darkness. She wasn't alone. She had allies. There was still a chance to stop Thorn, to avert the disaster. Midnight, the crossroads. She checked the time. It was already past 11. She had less than an hour to prepare to reach the rendezvous point to meet her unknown allies, the crossroads. She knew the place, an ancient intersection in the heart of the old city where several ancient roads converged, a place steeped in history, shrouded in shadows, a fitting location for a clandestine meeting. She grabbed her coat, David's USB drive safely tucked away in her pocket, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She was walking into the unknown, trusting in the cryptic message, placing her fate in the hands of strangers, but she had no other choice. She had to take the risk to meet the Keepers, to join forces, to fight back against Thorn and his cult, to stop the reawakening before it was too late. The clock was ticking. The full moon was rising, and the crossroads awaited. Evelyn arrived at the crossroads just before midnight, the ancient intersection shrouded in shadows, the city lights casting long, distorted shapes that danced on the cobblestone streets. The air was still and heavy, a sense of anticipation hanging in the silence. She scanned the shadows, her senses on high alert, searching for any sign of the Keepers, any indication of danger. The crossroads were deserted, seemingly empty, yet Evelyn felt a presence, a sense of being watched, of being assessed from the darkness. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping out of a darkened alleyway, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a high collar, their form cloaked in a long, dark coat. They moved with an air of quiet authority, their gaze sharp and assessing as they approached Evelyn. "Dr. Hayes," the figure asked, their voice low and measured, their features still hidden in shadow. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart pounding. "I received your message. I have the evidence." She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the USB drive, ready to present David's information, to prove her claims, to forge an alliance. The figure nodded slowly, their gaze unwavering. "We have been watching you, Dr. Hayes. We know what you have discovered. We know what you have risked." They stepped closer, their hand reaching out, extending towards Evelyn. "We are the Keepers. We are here to help you." Evelyn hesitated for a moment, a flicker of doubt, a lingering fear of betrayal, but she had no other choice. She had to trust them, to take the leap of faith, to believe in the possibility of an alliance, a chance to fight back. She reached out her hand, grasping the figure's extended hand, a silent pact forged in the shadows of the ancient crossroads. Their hands clasped firmly, a transfer of trust, a joining of forces, a shared resolve to face the darkness together. "Show us the evidence, Dr. Hayes," the Keeper said, their voice firm but reassuring. "Show us what David gave you, and tell us everything you know." Evelyn nodded, pulling out the USB drive, handing it to the Keeper, her voice trembling slightly as she began to recount the events of the past few days. The escalating rituals, the spectral figures, Thorn's treachery, David's sacrifice, the prophecy of the Devourer of Light, the impending full moon, the desperate race against time. She spoke of the cult, of Thorn's plan for godhood, of the Osiris Foundation's hidden agendas, of the impending darkness threatening to engulf the world. She poured out her story, her fears, her hopes, her desperate plea for help, her voice echoing in the stillness of the crossroads, a whisper of defiance against the rising tide of ancient evil. The Keeper listened intently, their gaze unwavering, their presence a source of strength, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. As Evelyn finished her tale, the Keeper nodded slowly, their expression grim but resolute. "We believe you, Dr. Hayes," the Keeper said, their voice firm and unwavering. "We have suspected Thorn's ambitions for some time. David's sacrifice has confirmed our worst fears. We will help you stop him. We will fight alongside you against this darkness." They paused, their gaze hardening. "But time is short. The full moon is almost upon us. We must act quickly, decisively. We must infiltrate the museum, confront Thorn, disrupt the ritual, and prevent the Devourer from rising." "Are you with us, Dr. Hayes?" Evelyn met the keeper's gaze, her heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose, a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She was no longer alone. She had allies, protectors, fellow warriors in this ancient battle against darkness. "Yes," she said, her voice firm and resolute, echoing in the stillness of the crossroads. "I am with you. Let's stop Thorn. Let's save the world." The keeper nodded, a faint smile flickering beneath their hidden features. "Then let us begin. The museum awaits, and the clock is ticking." Together they turned and moved back into the shadows, disappearing into the labyrinthine streets of the old city, their clandestine alliance forged in the darkness, their mission to confront the ancient evil and fight for the light, their desperate race against time about to begin. The full moon was rising, casting its eerie glow over the city, a silent countdown to the lunar apex, the moment of truth, the final stand against the devourer of light. The keeper, still cloaked in shadow, gestured towards the darkened streets leading back towards the museum district. "We move now. The ritual will be reaching its peak as the moon ascends. We must be swift and silent." Evelyn nodded, her heart pounding in sync with a newfound sense of purpose. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now intertwined with a steely resolve, fueled by David's sacrifice and the keeper's unwavering presence. The keepers, as they moved from the shadows, revealed themselves to be a group of 4, each cloaked and hooded like their leader. They moved with a practiced efficiency, their footsteps silent on the cobblestones, their forms blending seamlessly with the darkness of the city night. Evelyn followed, feeling a strange sense of protection within their ranks, a silent promise of shared purpose and unwavering support. Their infiltration of the museum was a masterclass in stealth. The keeper, who introduced themselves simply as Anubis for the immediate mission, moved with an almost preternatural awareness, guiding them through back alleys, service entrances, and forgotten passages, bypassing the enhanced security patrols with an uncanny ease. They moved like shadows themselves, slipping through the cracks in Thorn's defenses, their presence undetected, their purpose concealed. Reaching the museum's perimeter, Anubis led them to a less guarded service entrance, a heavy steel door usually used for deliveries, now shrouded in darkness. With practiced ease, Anubis produced a set of specialized tools, deftly manipulating the lock mechanisms, the faint clicks echoing in the stillness of the night. The heavy door swung silently inward, revealing a dimly lit service corridor, a hidden artery within the museum's vast structure. "We move in silence," Anubis whispered, their voice barely audible. "Thorn's men will be vigilant. We must avoid detection until we reach the Hall of Dynasties." The keepers nodded, their movements becoming even more deliberate, their silence absolute. They moved through the service corridor, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor, their forms blending with the shadows, their presence a phantom whisper in the museum's silent heart. As they approached the Hall of Dynasties, the scent of incense grew stronger, more overpowering, a cloying, almost suffocating fragrance that permeated the air. A low, rhythmic chanting echoed from beyond the closed exhibit doors, a chilling drone that resonated deep within Evelyn's bones, a palpable sign that the ritual was underway, that time was rapidly running out. Anubis stopped before the heavy oak doors of the Hall of Dynasties, gesturing for the others to halt. They listened intently, the chanting growing louder, more frenzied, the scent of incense almost overwhelming. "They are inside," Anubis whispered, their voice grim. "The ritual is reaching its climax. We must breach the hall and disrupt them before it is too late." Anubis produced another tool, a small, intricately carved amulet, holding it aloft. A faint blue glow emanated from the amulet, pulsing gently, a subtle energy radiating outwards. "This will mask our presence for a short time," Anubis explained, their voice barely audible. "But it will not last. We must be swift and decisive." The keepers nodded, their faces grim, their eyes focused on the heavy oak doors, the gateway to the chaotic ritual beyond. With a silent signal, Anubis moved forward, pushing against the heavy doors, the ancient hinges groaning softly as they swung inward, revealing the scene within the Hall of Dynasties, a chaotic tableau of ritualistic fervor and ancient power. The hall was bathed in an eerie, flickering light, cast by dozens of candles scattered throughout the space, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed and shifted across the colossal statues, imbuing them with an unsettling animation. The air was thick with incense smoke, swirling and eddying around the cloaked figures, obscuring their forms, creating a hallucinatory haze. In the center of the hall, before the towering statue of Sekhmet, the altar was now fully constructed, a makeshift structure of crates and draped cloth, laden with artifacts, canopic jars, offering bowls, amulets, fragments of pottery, all pulsating with an unnatural energy, all radiating a faint, ethereal glow. The dark feather, now at the center of the altar, pulsed with a brighter light, a focal point of the ritual's power, a conduit to the unseen entity they were summoning. Around the altar, the cultists stood in a frenzied circle, their chanting reaching a fever pitch, their bodies swaying rhythmically, their masked faces contorted in ecstatic fervor. At the head of the altar, the initiate stood, their robes more elaborate, their masked face radiating an unnerving intensity, the obsidian knife held aloft, its surface gleaming wickedly in the candlelight. And standing beside the initiate, his tailored suit incongruous amidst the chaotic ritual, his eyes burning with fanatical zeal, was Sela's Thorn. Thorn was no longer the smooth, enigmatic representative of the Osiris Foundation. His mask of composure had shattered, revealing a raw, power-hungry fanatic, consumed by ambition, driven by a desperate desire for apotheosis. He watched the ritual with rapturous intensity, his gaze fixed on the altar, on the pulsing feather, on the obsidian knife, his body vibrating with anticipation, his face illuminated by an unholy light. As Evelyn and the keepers breached the hall, their presence masked by Anubis's amulet, a moment of stunned silence descended upon the chaotic scene. The chanting faltered, the cultists turning their masked faces towards the intruders, their eyes widening with surprise and anger. Thorn whirled around, his gaze locking onto Evelyn, his face contorting with fury, his carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. "Hayes," he roared, his voice raw with rage, shattering the ritualistic calm. "You dare to interfere. You cannot stop what is about to happen. The devourer will rise, and I will become a god." His voice echoed through the hall, filled with megalomaniacal fervor, the pronouncements of a man consumed by delusion and power. Anubis stepped forward, their voice cutting through Thorn's rant, firm and authoritative. "Thorn, your ambition blinds you. You play with forces you cannot control. This ritual will unleash destruction, not divinity." The keepers fanned out, positioning themselves between Evelyn and the advancing cultists, their cloaks swirling around them like shadows, their presence a silent challenge to Thorn's authority. Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the hall. "Control, I will control it all. The devourer, the world, everything. You cannot stop me, keepers. The time of awakening is at hand. The lunar apex is upon us." He gestured to the cultists, his voice rising to a frenzy. "Destroy them, protect the ritual, the devourer must rise." Chaos erupted. The cultists surged forward, their chanting replaced by guttural cries, their masked faces contorted in fanatical rage. Thorn lunged towards Evelyn, his eyes burning with hatred, his hands outstretched, his intent clear: to silence her, to eliminate the threat to his grand design. The keepers moved to intercept the cultists, engaging them in a fierce melee, their movements swift and precise, their cloaks swirling like dark wings, their ancient knowledge and training clashing against the cultists' fanatical fervor. As Thorn advanced on Evelyn, Anubis intercepted him, their cloaks colliding, their forms locked in a desperate struggle. The hall descended into pandemonium, a chaotic battleground of cloaked figures and fanatical cultists, the air thick with incense smoke, the chanting replaced by shouts, screams, and the clash of bodies. And then the artifacts awoke. As the battle raged around the altar, the ancient objects, imbued with ritualistic energy, stirred to life. The canopic jars levitated from the altar, their alabaster surfaces glowing faintly, their lids rattling open, releasing spectral forms that coalesced into jackal-headed figures, miniature Anubis guardians, snarling and snapping at the combatants. The offering bowls, filled with replica food offerings, erupted in flames, the flames leaping outwards, seeking to engulf the intruders, burning with an unnatural heat. The amulets, scattered across the altar, animated, swirling in the air like angry wasps, their sharp edges and pointed forms becoming deadly projectiles, stinging and piercing flesh. The hall transformed into a living, breathing entity, the ancient artifacts rising up to defend their sacred space, attacking both sides indiscriminately, blurring the lines between attacker and defender, creating a chaotic free-for-all. Cultists and keepers alike were struck by animated amulets, scorched by spectral flames, harassed by miniature Anubis guardians, the battle descending into a surreal, terrifying chaos. Evelyn, caught in the midst of the artifact uprising, stumbled back, narrowly avoiding a volley of animated amulets, her heart pounding with terror and disbelief. The artifacts were alive, animated by the ritualistic energy, attacking everything that moved, creating an unpredictable and deadly battlefield. She saw a keeper being swarmed by miniature Anubis figures, another screaming as spectral flames engulfed their cloak, a cultist collapsing as an amulet pierced their neck. The hall was a maelstrom of chaos, ancient power unleashed, spiraling out of control. Amidst the pandemonium, Evelyn's gaze fell upon the altar, upon the pulsing dark feather, the focal point of the ritual, the source of the artifact's animation, the key to the Devourer's reawakening. And then she noticed something, a subtle detail she had overlooked before, a flaw in the ritual's design, a potential weakness. The altar, while laden with powerful artifacts, was incomplete. One crucial element was missing, a key component mentioned in the prophecy, a vital link in the ritualistic chain. The Book of Amun-Ra had described the need for a vessel of life, a living sacrifice to fully empower the ritual, to provide the Devourer with the life force necessary for its complete reawakening, for Thorn's apotheosis. And that vessel, that living sacrifice, was absent from the altar. Thorn, in his arrogance and his belief in his own power, had overlooked this crucial detail. Assuming that the ancient artifacts and the lunar alignment would be sufficient, that the Devourer's hunger could be sated by inanimate objects, by symbolic offerings. He was wrong. The prophecy was clear. A living sacrifice was required to complete the ritual, to unleash the full power of the Devourer to achieve Thorn's twisted ambition. And without that sacrifice, the ritual was incomplete, flawed, vulnerable. A spark of hope ignited within Evelyn, a desperate gamble, a risky maneuver, but potentially the only way to disrupt the ritual, to exploit this unforeseen weakness. She had to reach the altar, to sever the connection, to break the ritualistic chain, to prevent the Devourer from rising, to stop Thorn from achieving his godlike ambition. But to reach the altar, she had to navigate the chaotic battlefield, to evade the animated artifacts, to confront Thorn and his cult, to overcome the rising tide of ancient power unleashed within the Hall of Dynasties. And the full moon, now directly overhead, cast its eerie glow through the high arched windows, illuminating the chaotic scene, a silent countdown to the lunar apex, the moment of truth, the final, desperate stand against the encroaching darkness. The battle had just begun, and the fate of the world hung precariously in the balance. Evelyn recognized the vulnerability, a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness, the missing vessel of life. Thorn's hubris had blinded him to a fundamental requirement, a critical flaw in his grand design. This incomplete ritual, while unleashing chaotic energies and animating the artifacts, was not yet fully potent, not yet capable of fully birthing the Devourer, not yet able to transform Thorn into his godlike ideal. It was a desperate chance, a fragile thread of hope in the swirling chaos. Ignoring the animated amulets buzzing around her head like metallic hornets and the spectral flames licking at the edges of the display cases, Evelyn pushed forward, her focus laser-sharp on the altar and the pulsing feather. She had to reach it, to sever the connection, to disrupt the ritual before Thorn, or the entity itself, could rectify the missing element, before the full moon reached its zenith, before the Devourer truly awakened. But Ben Carter blocked her path, his face a mask of fanatical fury, his eyes blazing with an unsettling light. He lunged again, more aggressively this time, his movements wild, almost animalistic, his chanting a guttural snarl. Evelyn dodged again, more narrowly this time, his fingers brushing her arm, sending a jolt of cold dread through her. He was infused with the ritualistic energy, empowered by the very forces they were trying to stop, his strength enhanced, his resolve unbreakable. "You will not defile the awakening," he shrieked, his voice distorted, almost inhuman. "The Devourer hungers, and Thorn will feed it, and we will be rewarded." He attacked again, a flurry of wild punches and kicks, his movements unpredictable, his fanaticism making him reckless, dangerous. Evelyn, relying on adrenaline and desperation, fought back, her movements instinctive, defensive, trying to evade his attacks, to create an opening to get past him and reach the altar. She ducked under a wild swing, sidestepped a lunging kick, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her muscles screaming in protest. She was not a fighter, not trained for combat, but the urgency of the situation, the weight of the impending doom, fueled her, pushing her beyond her physical limits. As they grappled, the animated artifacts intensified their attacks, the miniature Anubis figures snapping at their heels, the spectral flames licking at their clothes, the amulets buzzing around them like a deadly swarm. The chaos in the hall reached a fever pitch, a swirling vortex of chanting, shouting, clashing, animated artifacts, and the ever-present cloying scent of incense. Suddenly, a figure slammed into Carter from the side, sending him sprawling, momentarily stunned. It was Anubis, having disengaged from their struggle with Thorn, intervening to protect Evelyn, their movements swift and decisive. "Go, Dr. Hayes," Anubis shouted, their voice echoing above the din. "Reach the altar, disrupt the ritual, we will hold them." Taking advantage of the brief opening, Evelyn surged forward, pushing past the stunned Carter, ignoring the stinging attacks of the animated amulets, her eyes fixed on the altar and the pulsing dark feather. She reached the altar, the air around it crackling with energy, the scent of incense almost overwhelming, the pulsing feather radiating an intense, ethereal glow. It was warm to the touch, vibrating with a strange, unsettling energy, a conduit to something ancient and powerful, something hungry and dark. She reached for the feather, her hand trembling, her mind racing, unsure of what to do, how to sever the connection, how to disrupt the ritual. The Book of Amun-Ra offered cryptic clues, hints of pure heart, ancient knowledge, and a sacrifice of self. But what did it all mean? What sacrifice was required? What ancient knowledge could she access in this moment of chaos and desperation? As she hesitated, Thorn, having recovered from his brief struggle with Anubis, lunged towards her, his face contorted with rage, his eyes burning with fanatical fury. "No," he roared, his voice echoing through the hall. "You will not stop me, the power is mine." He reached for the feather, his hand outstretched, his intent clear, to seize it, to claim its power, to complete the ritual, to become the Devourer's vessel, to achieve his twisted apotheosis. In that instant, a surge of clarity flooded Evelyn's mind, a sudden understanding of the prophecy's cryptic words, a flash of ancient knowledge illuminating the path forward. A vessel of life, the prophecy had said, a living sacrifice, not for the devourer but against it. A sacrifice not of blood but of will, of self, a channeling of life force not to empower the darkness, but to sever its connection, to disrupt the ritual, to banish the entity back to the void from whence it came. With a surge of adrenaline, Evelyn grasped the pulsing feather, not to seize its power but to channel her own. She closed her eyes, focusing her mind, her will, her very life force, channeling it into the feather, pouring her energy into the ancient artifact, not as a sacrifice to the devourer, but as a counterforce, a disruptive wave, a surge of life against the encroaching darkness. A wave of energy erupted from the feather, a blinding white light that pulsed outwards, engulfing the altar, the hall, everything in its path. The chanting abruptly ceased, the cultists recoiling, shielding their eyes, screaming in pain. The animated artifacts faltered, their movements jerky, erratic, their glowing forms flickering, dimming, losing their unnatural vitality. Thorn screamed, a sound of pure agony and disbelief, his body convulsing, his face contorted in a mask of terror as the white light enveloped him. The light intensified, growing brighter, hotter, pushing back the darkness, dispelling the incense smoke, banishing the spectral shadows, cleansing the hall of the ritualistic energy. The air crackled with power, a palpable force that pushed against Evelyn, threatening to overwhelm her, to consume her, to drain her very life force. But she held on, her grip tightening on the feather, her will unwavering, channeling her energy, her sacrifice of self, into the heart of the ritual, pushing back against the devourer's encroaching influence. Then, as suddenly as it began, the white light subsided, fading away, leaving behind a stunned silence, a lingering scent of ozone, and a hall transformed. The candles were extinguished, plunged into darkness. The incense smoke had dissipated, the air clear and sharp. The animated artifacts were still, inert, lifeless, scattered across the floor, their brief animation extinguished. The cultists lay scattered, groaning, whimpering, their fanatical fervor replaced by dazed confusion, their cloaks charred and smoking. Thorn was gone, vanished. reduced to nothing but a faint scorch mark on the floor where he had stood, a testament to the power he had sought to control, the power that had ultimately consumed him. Evelyn stood trembling, exhausted, drained of energy, but alive, unharmed, the dark feather now inert in her hand, its pulsing glow extinguished, its power seemingly dissipated. The silence in the hall was profound, broken only by the ragged breathing of the keepers and the whimpering of the scattered cultists. The chaos had subsided, the ritual disrupted, the devourer banished, Thorn defeated. But the cost had been immense. Anubis approached Evelyn, their cloaked form moving through the stillness, their presence a source of quiet strength. "Dr. Hayes," they said, their voice low and measured, "are you all right?" Evelyn nodded slowly, her voice weak, barely a whisper. I think so, but Thorn, he's gone." Anubis nodded grimly, consumed by the very power he sought to wield, a fitting end for such hubris. They paused, their gaze sweeping over the chaotic scene, the scattered cultists, the inert artifacts, the scorch mark on the floor. "The ritual is disrupted. The devourer is banished for now. You have done well, Dr. Hayes. You have saved us all." Evelyn looked around the hall, the silence and stillness a stark contrast to the chaotic frenzy of moments before. Her museum was safe for now. But the events of the night, the horrors she had witnessed, the sacrifices that had been made would forever be etched in her memory. David's sacrifice, Anubis and the Keeper's intervention, her own desperate gamble, it had all come together. A fragile victory against overwhelming odds. But the darkness, she knew, was not entirely vanquished, merely pushed back, held at bay. The devourer was banished, but the prophecy spoke of a reawakening, a cyclical return. And the Osiris Foundation, with its hidden factions and sinister agendas, remained a shadowy force, lurking in the background, waiting for another opportunity, another moment of weakness, another chance to unleash ancient powers upon the world. The battle had been won, but the war, she feared, was far from over. And as the first rays of dawn began to filter through the high arched windows of the Hall of Dynasties, casting a pale light over the scene of chaos and quiet victory, Evelyn knew that her life, and the fate of the museum, had been irrevocably changed, forever bound to the ancient mysteries and the ongoing struggle against the encroaching darkness. The dawn brought a fragile peace, but it was a peace built on sacrifice and shadowed by the knowledge of a continuing, unseen war. The silence that descended after the blinding flash was thick and heavy, a stark contrast to the chaotic frenzy that had preceded it. Evelyn stood, heart still pounding, lungs burning, the inert dark feather clutched in her hand. The air, once thick with incense and chanting, now tasted clean and sharp, carrying only the faint metallic tang of ozone. Around her, the Hall of Dynasties was a tableau of stillness, a battlefield frozen in time. The keepers, though breathing heavily, stood their ground, cloaks slightly disheveled but their forms unbroken. The cultists, scattered like broken dolls, lay groaning on the marble floor, their masked faces now visible, revealing expressions of confusion and pain, the fanaticism extinguished like a snuffed candle. Thorn, the architect of this chaos, was simply gone, erased, leaving only a dark scorch mark as a grim testament to his ambition and its fatal consequences. Anubis approached Evelyn, their hooded gaze assessing her, a silent question in their posture. "Are you truly unharmed, Dr. Hayes?" they asked again, their voice resonating with a quiet concern. Evelyn managed a weak nod, her legs feeling like lead, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Physically, yes," she whispered, her voice raspy, "but I feel drained, empty." The act of channeling her own life force, the sacrifice of self, had taken its toll, leaving her feeling hollowed out, yet strangely cleansed. Anubis nodded understandingly. "You have expended a great deal of energy, Dr. Hayes. You tapped into a powerful force, a life force, to counter the devourer's influence. Rest is needed, but you have prevailed." They gestured towards the scattered cultists. "We will secure these individuals. They are no longer a threat, their fervor broken, their leader vanquished." Anubis turned to the other keepers, issuing silent commands with subtle gestures. The keepers moved with practiced efficiency, securing the disoriented cultists, binding their hands with cord they produced from within their cloaks, their movements swift and silent. Evelyn watched them work, a profound sense of exhaustion washing over her, but also a deep, quiet satisfaction. They had done it. Against all odds, they had stopped Thorn, they had disrupted the ritual, they had banished the devourer. The museum, her sanctuary, was safe. The city, and perhaps the world, had been spared from an unimaginable darkness. But the victory felt fragile, tinged with the lingering scent of incense and the ghostly echoes of chanting, a reminder of the ancient forces that still lurked beneath the surface of the modern world. Her gaze fell upon the scorch mark on the floor, the only remaining trace of Silas Thorn, the enigmatic representative of the Osiris Foundation, the power-hungry fanatic who had sought to become a god. His ambition had been his undoing, his hubris leading him to a catastrophic end. But the Osiris Foundation itself remained, a shadowy organization with unknown agendas and vast resources. Thorn may be gone, but the Foundation's influence, its secrets, its potential for future machinations, still lingered, a cloud on the horizon of their fragile victory. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked, turning to Anubis, her voice still weak but laced with a renewed sense of purpose. "With the cultists, with the Osiris Foundation." Anubis considered her question for a moment, their hooded gaze thoughtful. "The cultists are broken, their faith shattered. They are no longer a threat in their current state. We will ensure they are contained for now. Their minds will need guidance, perhaps, to redirect their energies away from such destructive paths." Anubis paused, their gaze turning towards the scorch mark again. As for the Osiris Foundation, Thorn was but one faction, a rogue element within a larger, more complex organization. His methods were extreme even for them. The Keepers have long suspected internal divisions within the Foundation, rival factions vying for control, for access to ancient power. Thorn's actions may have disrupted their delicate balance, exposed their hidden agendas to the light. Anubis turned back to Evelyn, their gaze direct, their voice firm. "David's evidence, the USB drive you carry, it is crucial. It details Thorn's plans, his faction, his methods. It exposes the rot within the Osiris Foundation. We will use this evidence, Dr. Hayes. We will bring Thorn's faction to light. We will expose their treachery to the wider world. The Keepers will ensure that the Osiris Foundation is held accountable for Thorn's actions, for the danger they have unleashed upon this museum, upon this city." Evelyn nodded, a spark of hope flickering within her weariness. "David, he wanted to expose them. He sacrificed himself to give me that evidence. We owe it to him to see it through." She reached into her pocket, retrieving the blood-stained USB drive, offering it to Anubis. "Here, it's all here, everything he gathered." Anubis took the USB drive, their touch gentle, almost reverent. "David's sacrifice will not be in vain, Dr. Hayes. His courage, his dedication will be remembered, and his evidence will be used to bring justice, to ensure that Thorn's darkness does not spread further." Anubis nodded to one of the other Keepers, who stepped forward, receiving the USB drive with a silent nod, disappearing back into the shadows to secure the crucial evidence. The first rays of dawn were now painting the high arched windows of the Hall of Dynasties with a pale, ethereal light, chasing away the shadows, dispelling the lingering darkness. The museum, once a battleground, was slowly returning to its familiar state of silent grandeur, the colossal statues looming serenely in the soft morning light, oblivious to the chaotic events of the night. But for Evelyn and for the Keepers, the hall would never be quite the same, forever marked by the scent of incense, the echoes of chanting, and the memory of a battle fought against ancient darkness. "We must leave now, Dr. Hayes," Anubis said, their voice bringing Evelyn back to the present. "The museum will soon be stirring, the staff arriving. Our presence here must remain discreet for now. We will contact you again, Dr. Hayes. We will need your knowledge, your expertise, your courage in the days to come. The battle against the darkness is not over, but for tonight we have won a crucial victory." Evelyn nodded, accepting the inevitable parting, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and melancholy. The Keepers, these enigmatic protectors of ancient knowledge, had appeared from the shadows, fought alongside her, and vanished back into the darkness, leaving her both indebted and strangely alone once more. But she knew they were out there, watching, working, their hidden network a silent shield against the encroaching darkness. Anubis gestured to the remaining Keepers, and with a final nod to Evelyn, they moved silently towards the service entrance, disappearing back into the labyrinthine corridors of the museum, leaving Evelyn alone in the stillness of the Hall of Dynasties, surrounded by the inert artifacts, the subdued cultists, and the lingering scent of ozone and incense. Evelyn stood for a moment longer, taking in the scene, the fragile peace of the dawn-lit hall, the quiet aftermath of the chaotic night. She felt exhausted, drained, but also strangely empowered, changed by the events she had witnessed, by the ancient forces she had confronted, by the sacrifices that had been made. She was no longer just a curator, a scholar of ancient Egypt. She was something more, something forged in the crucible of fear and courage, a guardian of the museum, a protector against the encroaching darkness. With a deep breath, Evelyn turned and walked out of the Hall of Dynasties, leaving behind the battlefield, the ghosts of chanting and gunfire, and the lingering scent of ancient power. She moved through the deserted museum halls, the early morning light filtering weakly through the high arched windows, casting long, distorted shadows, just as it had on that unsettling morning when she first noticed the anomalies, the subtle shifts, the whispers of awakening. But today the shadows felt different, less menacing, imbued with a sense of quiet resilience, a silent promise of a future yet to be written, a future where the light, however fragile, still held the darkness at bay. The museum awaited, the city stirred, and Evelyn knew her journey was far from over. The dawn had broken, but the ancient mysteries and the ongoing battle against the encroaching darkness continued. The fragile peace of the dawn-lit Hall of Dynasties was deceptive. Despite the stillness of the inert artifacts and the subdued presence of the bound cultists, Evelyn felt a lingering unease, a subtle tremor in the air that belied the apparent victory. The devourer might be banished, Thorn vanquished, but the air still crackled with residual energy, a faint echo of the ancient power that had been unleashed and then abruptly contained. It was like the aftermath of a violent storm, the sky clearing, the sun breaking through, but the scent of ozone and the debris scattered around a stark reminder of the tempest that had just passed. Anubis, ever perceptive, seemed to sense her unease. The disruption was effective, Dr. Hayes, they said, their voice low, but the entity's influence lingers. A cleansing is needed to ensure its complete banishment to purify this space. The other keepers nodded in agreement, their cloaked forms radiating a quiet intensity, their senses attuned to the subtle energies still swirling within the hall. Evelyn looked around at the scene of the night's battle, the scattered artifacts, the subdued cultists, the scorched mark on the floor. The hall, though physically intact, felt violated, defiled by the dark ritual that had been performed within its ancient walls. A cleansing ritual, a counter-ritual felt necessary, not just to banish the lingering influence, but to restore the hall, to reclaim its sanctity, to heal the psychic wounds inflicted upon the museum. What kind of cleansing ritual? Evelyn asked, turning back to Anubis, her voice still weak, but laced with a growing sense of urgency. What do we need to do? Anubis considered for a moment, their hooded gaze sweeping across the hall, assessing the residual energies, the lingering shadows. A ritual of purification, they said finally. One to dispel the darkness, to restore balance, to reconsecrate this space to its original purpose, a sanctuary of knowledge, a repository of history, not a conduit for ancient chaos. Anubis turned to Evelyn, their gaze direct, their voice firm. You are the curator, Dr. Hayes. You are the keeper of this hall. You must perform this ritual. We will guide you, we will assist you, but the power must flow through you. The cleansing must come from your heart, your will, your connection to this place. Evelyn felt a surge of both fear and determination. Another ritual, another confrontation with ancient forces after the exhausting ordeal of the night. But she knew Anubis was right. She was the curator, the keeper of this hall. The responsibility fell to her, the burden of cleansing, of restoring balance, of ensuring the museum's continued safety. She had faced the devourer's influence once. She had survived. She had prevailed. She could do it again. She had to. Tell me what to do, Evelyn said, her voice gaining strength, her weariness momentarily forgotten in the face of this new challenge. Tell me what ritual is needed, what I must perform. Anubis nodded, their gaze approving. We will use the artifacts themselves, Dr. Hayes. We will repurpose the objects of darkness, transforming them into instruments of light. We will use the canopic jars, the offering bowls, the amulets, not to summon chaos, but to dispel it, to purify this space, to banish the lingering influence of the devourer. Anubis gestured to the other keepers, issuing silent instructions. The keepers moved with practiced efficiency, gathering the inert artifacts, rearranging them within the hall. transforming the chaotic remnants of Thorn's ritual into the components of a counter-ritual, a cleansing ceremony. Guided by Anubis and assisted by the keepers, Evelyn began to prepare for the cleansing ritual. They rearranged the canopic jars, not in a menacing semicircle as Thorn had done, but in a protective circle around Evelyn, their alabaster surfaces now radiating a soft, calming light. Their spectral Anubis guardians now silent and watchful, no longer snarling but serene, almost benevolent. The offering bowls, once erupting in spectral flames, were now filled with fresh water, purified by ancient incantations whispered by the keepers, the water shimmering with a gentle, cleansing energy. The amulets, once buzzing like deadly insects, were now arranged around the perimeter of the hall, forming a protective barrier, their surfaces radiating a soft, golden light, their protective symbols now empowered with positive energy, warding off any lingering darkness. Anubis instructed Evelyn in the ancient chants, the words of purification, the invocations to the benevolent deities of light and order, the counterspells to banish the residual influence of the devourer. The words were ancient, resonant, imbued with a power that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the museum, echoing the echoes of countless rituals performed in this space over millennia. As Evelyn chanted, her voice, though still weak, gained strength, resonating with a newfound authority. A connection to the ancient energies flowing through the museum, through the artifacts, through her own being. As the cleansing ritual began, a subtle shift occurred within the hall. The lingering unease, the faint tremor in the air, intensified, becoming more pronounced, more unsettling. The shadows in the corners of the hall seemed to deepen, to writhe, to coalesce into indistinct forms, as if the banished devourer was resisting the purification, fighting back against the encroaching light, its residual influence struggling to maintain its hold on the space. A faint whisper echoed through the hall, a sibilant sound, barely audible, yet undeniably present. A psychic murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a voice of ancient darkness, resisting banishment, clinging to existence. The museum itself seemed to react to the cleansing ritual, to the entity's resistance. A low tremor ran through the building, a subtle vibration that resonated through the marble floors, the colossal statues, the very foundations of the Grand Alexandria. Display cases rattled gently, ancient artifacts shifted minutely on their pedestals. The high arched windows vibrated softly, a low hum resonating through the glass. The museum itself groaning under the strain of the psychic battle, the clash between light and darkness, purification and resistance. The psychic whisper intensified, becoming more distinct, more menacing, no longer a murmur but a voice. A sibilant hiss that seemed to penetrate Evelyn's mind, whispering insidious words, tempting her with promises of power, of knowledge, of forbidden secrets, seeking to corrupt the cleansing ritual, to turn it into a summoning, to re-establish the devourer's connection to the museum, to reclaim its hold on this ancient space. Evelyn felt a cold tendril of psychic influence reach into her mind, probing her thoughts, her fears, her desires, seeking to exploit her weariness, her vulnerability, to turn her against the cleansing ritual, to corrupt her will, to make her a vessel for the devourer's return. Images flashed through her mind, distorted visions of power and darkness, temptations of forbidden knowledge, whispers of ancient secrets, promises of unimaginable power, all designed to lure her, to seduce her, to break her resolve. She fought back fiercely, desperately, focusing her will, her mind, her very being against the psychic assault, drawing strength from the ancient chants, from the protective circle of canopic jars, from the unwavering presence of the keepers, from the memory of David's sacrifice, from her own deep connection to the museum, to its history, to its purpose as a sanctuary of knowledge and light. She pushed back against the insidious whispers, against the tempting visions, against the encroaching darkness, channeling her life force, her will to resist, to banish, to purify, to reclaim the museum from the devourer's influence. The museum trembled more violently now, the low tremor escalating into a perceptible shaking, the walls groaning, the display cases rattling more loudly, the high-arched windows vibrating more intensely, the building itself protesting against the psychic battle raging within its ancient walls. Dust rained down from the high ceilings, the air growing thick with the scent of disturbed dust and ozone. the museum itself seemingly groaning under the strain of the entity's desperate resistance, the clash of ancient powers. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the Hall of Dynasties burst open, crashing against the walls with a resounding boom, shattering the ritualistic calm, interrupting the chanting, flooding the hall with harsh light from the museum corridors, and revealing a chaotic scene of uniformed security guards pouring into the hall, weapons drawn, their faces grim, their eyes wide with alarm and confusion. Leading the charge, his face pale but resolute, his weapon raised, was Captain Mark Olson. Olson, responding to the earlier alarm, had finally rallied his security forces, breaching the Hall of Dynasties, expecting to find chaos, cultists, perhaps even armed resistance. But he was confronted with a scene even more bewildering, more unsettling than he could have imagined: cloaked figures chanting, artifacts glowing, the museum itself shaking, and Dr. Hayes seemingly at the center of it all, her face pale but determined, her voice resonating with ancient words, surrounded by a circle of glowing canopic jars. Confusion warred with alarm on Olson's face, skepticism battling against the undeniable evidence of the impossible unfolding before his eyes. But there was no time for questions, no time for explanations. As Olson and his security team surged into the hall, the psychic backlash intensified, the Devourer's resistance reaching a fever pitch, its influence lashing out in a final, desperate attempt to disrupt the cleansing ritual, to reclaim its hold on the museum. A wave of psychic energy erupted from the altar, a visible ripple in the air, a distortion of light and shadow, a blast of raw, chaotic power that slammed into the hall, throwing cultists and keepers alike off their feet, sending animated amulets scattering wildly, extinguishing the gentle glow of the canopic jars and the offering bowls, plunging the hall back into a chaotic darkness, broken only by the flickering candlelight and the harsh glare of the security guards' flashlights. Evelyn, caught in the epicenter of the psychic blast, staggered back, her vision blurring, her mind reeling, the insidious whispers intensifying, threatening to overwhelm her will, to shatter her resolve. She felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, a searing heat that radiated outwards, a sudden weakness that threatened to buckle her knees. She cried out, stumbling, falling, the dark feather slipping from her grasp, tumbling to the marble floor, its inert form now powerless, its connection severed. As Evelyn fell, a figure moved swiftly, intercepting the psychic blast, shielding her from the full force of the entity's backlash. A dark shape lunged in front of her, absorbing the brunt of the chaotic energy, taking the psychic impact, protecting her from the full force of the Devourer's wrath. A grunt of pain echoed through the hall, a sharp intake of breath, a muffled cry. Then the figure crumpled, falling to the floor beside Evelyn, their bodies shielding her from the residual energy, their forms still, silent, unmoving. Evelyn's vision cleared, her mind slowly regaining focus, the insidious whispers receding, the psychic assault weakening. She looked down, her gaze falling upon the figure who had shielded her, who had taken the brunt of the psychic blast, who had sacrificed themselves to protect her. It was Olson. Captain Mark Olson, the gruff, skeptical security captain, the man who had initially dismissed her concerns, but who had ultimately come to believe, to understand, to fight alongside her against the encroaching darkness. Olson lay still, his eyes closed, his face pale, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his uniform, blooming crimson against the stark blue fabric. A wound visible on his shoulder, mirroring her own but deeper, more severe, a gaping tear in his flesh, oozing blood, a testament to the psychic force he had absorbed, the sacrifice he had made. "Olson," Evelyn cried out, her voice filled with anguish, reaching out to him, her hand hovering over his still form, her heart sinking with a wave of grief and terror. Olson, wounded, perhaps dying, protecting her from the Devourer's wrath, sacrificing himself in the chaotic darkness of the Hall of Dynasties. A final, selfless act of courage and loyalty, a testament to the unlikely alliance they had forged, the unexpected bond they had created in the face of ancient evil. The cleansing ritual was disrupted, the hall plunged back into chaos, Olson lay wounded, and the full moon, now at its zenith, cast its eerie glow through the shattered silence, a silent promise of more darkness to come. "Olson," Evelyn's cry was a ragged tear in the sudden silence, a sound of raw despair and disbelief. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his bloodied uniform, afraid to touch, afraid to confirm the horrifying reality. His chest barely moved, his breath shallow, ragged gasps that seemed to fight against the encroaching stillness. The crimson stain on his shoulder spread, a dark flower blooming against the blue fabric, a visual testament to the psychic wound he had taken for her. Tears blurred her vision, hot and stinging, as she looked at his pale face, the gruff lines softened in unconsciousness, the usual skepticism replaced by a fragile vulnerability. Olsen, the steadfast skeptic, the pragmatic security captain, had sacrificed himself for her, for the museum, for a world he had only just begun to believe in, a world he was now leaving behind. A wave of guilt washed over her, a crushing weight of responsibility for his injury, for the chaos that had unfolded, for the ancient forces she had unwittingly unleashed. But amidst the grief and despair, a flicker of understanding sparked in her mind, a chilling realization that Olsen's sacrifice, horrific as it was, had created an opening, a crucial window of opportunity. The Devourer's psychic backlash aimed at disrupting the cleansing ritual had been deflected, absorbed by Olsen, its power momentarily dissipated, its focus broken. The ritual was disrupted, yes, but not destroyed. The artifacts, though momentarily silenced, still held the potential for purification, for banishment. The full moon was at its zenith, its power at its peak, but the Devourer's influence was weakened, its connection frayed. This was their chance, their last, desperate chance to complete the counter-ritual, to banish the entity, to reclaim the museum from the encroaching darkness. Ignoring the tears streaming down her face, ignoring the trembling in her limbs, Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her gaze sweeping across the chaotic hall, taking in the subdued cultists, the watchful keepers, the stunned security guards, and the inert dark feather lying on the marble floor, now just a mundane object, its power seemingly spent. Anubis and the keepers were watching her, their cloaked forms radiating a silent urgency, a wordless encouragement. Olsen's sacrifice had bought them time, had created an opening, and it was up to her to seize it, to finish what they had started, to honor his selfless act. With a renewed surge of adrenaline, fueled by grief and resolve, Evelyn reached down and picked up the dark feather, its smooth surface cold against her trembling fingers. It felt different now, lighter, less charged, its connection to the Devourer seemingly severed. But it still held a residual energy, a faint echo of the ancient power it had once channeled. Perhaps, she thought, that residual energy could be repurposed, redirected, used to complete the cleansing ritual, to banish the entity, to heal the psychic wounds inflicted upon the museum. She turned back to the altar, the makeshift structure still standing amidst the chaos, the circle of canopic jars, the offering bowls filled with purified water, the amulets forming a protective barrier around the perimeter. The artifacts, though momentarily silenced, still held a latent power, a potential for cleansing, for banishment. She had to reignite that power, to channel it, to focus it, to complete the counter-ritual, to push back the darkness, to honor Olsen's sacrifice, to save the museum, to save the world. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn stepped back towards the altar, her voice rising above the stunned silence, her ancient chants resuming, hesitant at first, then gaining strength, resonating with a newfound urgency, a desperate plea for balance, for purification, for banishment. The keepers joined her, their voices blending with hers, their ancient incantations weaving a tapestry of sound, a counter-melody to the chanting of the cultists, a song of light against the whispers of darkness. As they chanted, a subtle energy began to stir within the hall again, a faint hum vibrating through the artifacts, a soft glow emanating from the canopic jars, the offering bowls, the amulets, a nascent light pushing back against the encroaching shadows, reclaiming the space, re-establishing the protective circle, reigniting the cleansing ritual. The air crackled with a renewed energy, not the chaotic power of the Devourer, but a gentler, more focused force. A purifying wave, a healing balm, a force of banishment, of cleansing, of restoration. Evelyn focused her will, her mind, her very being into the chants, into the dark feather clutched in her hand, channeling her grief for Olsen, her resolve to honor his sacrifice, her deep connection to the museum, her unwavering determination to banish the darkness. She poured her energy into the ritual, her voice growing stronger, more resonant, her chants echoing through the hall, weaving a protective shield, a banishing spell. a counter-ritual of immense power, fueled by sacrifice, driven by resolve, guided by ancient knowledge, empowered by her own unwavering will. The museum trembled again, but this time the vibration was different. Not a chaotic shaking, but a resonant hum, a vibration of cleansing energy, a tremor of purification. A building breathing deeply, expelling the darkness, embracing the light. The shadows in the corners of the hall receded, dissipating, vanishing completely, chased away by the growing light emanating from the artifacts, from Evelyn herself, from the combined will of the keepers. Their chants weaving a protective tapestry, a banishing spell, a shield against the encroaching darkness. The psychic whisper, the insidious voice of the devourer, weakened, fading, receding into the silence, its tempting promises, its dark allure, losing their power, their influence, their hold on the museum, on Evelyn's mind, on the world itself. The entity was resisting, struggling, fighting against the banishment, but the count ritual was too strong, too focused, too deeply rooted in ancient knowledge, too powerfully fueled by sacrifice and resolve. The tide was turning, the light was pushing back the darkness, the cleansing was taking hold, the banishment was succeeding. As the chanting reached its crescendo, as Evelyn poured the last vestiges of her energy into the ritual, as the keepers' voices resonated with ancient power, a blinding white light erupted from the altar again, even brighter, more intense than before, engulfing the entire hall, pushing back the remaining shadows, banishing the lingering darkness, purifying the space completely. The light pulsed outwards, a wave of cleansing energy washing over the hall, over the artifacts, over the cultists, over the keepers, over Evelyn herself. A wave of purification, of banishment, of restoration. Then, as suddenly as it began, the light subsided, fading away, leaving behind a profound silence, a complete stillness, a hall transformed. The candles flickered and died, plunging the hall into darkness for a fleeting moment. Then the emergency lights flickered on, casting a soft, even glow, revealing a scene of serene stillness, a hall cleansed, purified, restored. The incense scent had vanished completely, replaced by a clean, fresh air, a sense of lightness, of peace, of tranquility. The animated artifacts were utterly still, completely inert, scattered across the floor, now just mundane museum objects, devoid of any unnatural energy, their brief animation extinguished, their power dissipated. The cultists lay still, silent, unconscious, their fanatical fervor completely extinguished, their minds emptied, their bodies limp, their threat neutralized. Thorn was gone, utterly vanished, leaving no trace, no scorch mark, no lingering presence, as if he had never existed, erased from reality, consumed by the power he had sought to wield, banished to the void from whence he came. And then the artifacts fell silent. The faint hum that had been vibrating through the hall, the subtle energy that had been stirring within the ancient objects, dissipated completely, vanishing into the silence. The canopic jars, the offering bowls, the amulets, the statues themselves, all became still, inert, silent, returning to their mundane state, their ancient power dormant once more, their brief animation extinguished, their ritualistic purpose fulfilled. The Hall of Dynasties, once a chaotic battleground, once a conduit for ancient darkness, was now quiet, peaceful, restored to its original purpose. A sanctuary of history, a repository of knowledge, a silent testament to a civilization long past, its echoes now peaceful, its secrets now safely guarded, its ancient power once more contained. The museum itself seemed to exhale, a collective sigh of relief, the tremors ceasing, the vibrations fading, the groaning walls falling silent, the building settling back into its familiar stillness, its ancient stones regaining their peace, their equilibrium, their silence. The Grand Alexandria Museum, once on the brink of chaos, once threatened by ancient darkness, once a battleground between light and shadow, was now returning to normal, slowly, subtly, but undeniably returning to its familiar state of silent grandeur, its quiet contemplation, its peaceful embrace of history and culture. Evelyn stood in the profound silence, exhausted, drained, but strangely at peace. The dark feather fell from her numb fingers, landing softly on the marble floor, now just an ordinary feather, devoid of any power, any significance, any connection to the ancient darkness. She looked around at the hall, at the stillness of the artifacts, at the subdued cultists, at the watchful keepers, at the inert form of Olsen lying on the floor, her heart aching with grief and gratitude. They had done it. They had faced the darkness, they had fought, they had sacrificed, and they had prevailed. The devourer was banished, Thorn was gone, the museum was safe, and the world, for now, was spared. Anubis approached Evelyn, their cloaked form moving through the stillness, their presence a source of quiet strength and unwavering support. "It is done, Dr. Hayes," they said, their voice low and measured, filled with a quiet satisfaction. "The ritual is complete, the entity is banished, the hall is cleansed, you have succeeded." Anubis paused, their gaze turning towards Olson's still form, their voice softening with a note of somber respect. "In Captain Olson, he made the ultimate sacrifice. His courage, his selflessness ensured our victory. He will not be forgotten." Evelyn nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes again, grief and gratitude mingling in a complex wave of emotion. Olson's sacrifice, so unexpected, so selfless, so profound, had been the turning point, the catalyst for their victory, the ultimate act of courage in the face of ancient darkness. He had been the skeptic, the pragmatist, the man of logic and reason, yet he had embraced the impossible. He had fought for the unbelievable, and he had given his life to protect her, to protect the museum, to protect the world from a darkness he had only just begun to comprehend. "We must tend to Captain Olson," Anubis said, their voice bringing Evelyn back to the present, pulling her out of her grief-stricken reverie. "His wound is severe, but there is still hope. The keepers possess certain healing arts, ancient techniques that may yet save him, but time is of the essence." Anubis gestured to the other keepers, and with practiced efficiency they moved to Olson's side, carefully lifting his inert form, their movements gentle, respectful, reverent. As the keepers tended to Olson, as the security guards, now fully comprehending the gravity of the situation, began to secure the unconscious cultists, Evelyn stood in the stillness of the Hall of Dynasties, watching the first rays of dawn fully illuminate the ancient artifacts, casting a pale, ethereal light over the scene of chaos and quiet victory. Thorn was presumed dead, vanished without a trace, consumed by his own ambition, erased from the world. The Osiris Foundation, exposed, its secrets revealed, would face the consequences of Thorn's actions, of its own hidden agendas, its own dangerous games with ancient power. The museum, though scarred, though forever changed, was safe, cleansed, restored, ready to face a new day, a new dawn, a new chapter in its long and storied history. And Evelyn, changed, empowered, burdened by grief and responsibility, stood ready to face that new dawn, to continue her journey, to protect the museum, to guard against the encroaching darkness, to honor Olson's sacrifice, to carry the light forward into the uncertain future. The immediate aftermath of the night's events was a blur of activity, a chaotic dance between the mundane and the extraordinary. Olson, carefully carried by the keepers, was swiftly and discreetly moved from the Hall of Dynasties, disappearing into the museum's labyrinthine service corridors, his fate hanging precariously in the balance, entrusted to the keepers' ancient healing arts. The unconscious cultists, secured and bound, were handed over to the bewildered but now fully alerted security team, their fanatical fervor extinguished, their threat neutralized, their future uncertain, likely facing legal repercussions for their actions, for their involvement in the dangerous rituals. The museum staff, arriving for the early morning shift, were met with a scene of controlled chaos, security guards directing them away from the Hall of Dynasties, hushed whispers and anxious glances, a palpable tension hanging in the air. Rumors inevitably began to circulate, whispers of a security breach, of a disturbance in the ancient Egypt exhibit, of strange lights and sounds in the night, of Captain Olson's sudden absence. But the official narrative, carefully crafted and disseminated by the remaining security personnel under the now acting command of Officer Miller, was one of a minor security incident, quickly contained. No cause for alarm, museum operations proceeding as normal. Evelyn, exhausted but resolute, found herself thrust into a new role, no longer just a curator but a participant in a clandestine drama, a protector of ancient secrets, a guardian against encroaching darkness. She worked tirelessly through the day, navigating the delicate balance between maintaining normalcy for the museum's visitors and staff, and discreetly assessing the damage, both physical and psychic, inflicted upon the Hall of Dynasties. The artifacts, though inert, still carried a subtle residue of the ritualistic energy, a faint echo of the Devourer's influence. A thorough cleansing, a meticulous restoration, would be required to fully heal the psychic wounds, to completely erase the traces of the ancient darkness. Mr. Thorne, or rather the presumed remains of Mr. Thorne, remained a mystery, a void in the narrative, a chilling absence that spoke volumes about the power he had sought to wield, the power that had ultimately consumed him. His disappearance was officially attributed to the security incident, a vague explanation that satisfied the museum administration and the local authorities, who were discreetly informed of a rogue operative and internal security breach. Within the Osiris Foundation, a narrative carefully crafted by the keepers to deflect wider scrutiny and maintain a semblance of order. Thorne was presumed dead, lost in the chaos, a casualty of his own ambition, his fate a grim warning against tampering with forces beyond human comprehension. As the day wore on, the museum slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to return to normal. Visitors strolled through the halls, their voices hushed with the usual reverence for ancient artifacts, their footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors, seemingly oblivious to the extraordinary events that had transpired just hours before, unaware of the ancient battle fought in the shadows, the sacrifices made to protect the museum, to safeguard the world from an unimaginable darkness. The artifacts, silent and still, stood as silent witnesses, their ancient secrets guarded, their dormant power contained, their silence a fragile peace, a temporary respite in the ongoing, unseen war against the encroaching darkness. But Evelyn knew deep down that this peace was fragile, that the darkness was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity, another moment of weakness, another chance to rise again. And she, along with the keepers, would be ready, watching, guarding, protecting the museum and the world from the ancient mysteries and the ever-present threat of the encroaching darkness. Their vigilance a silent promise, a whispered vow, a continuing vigil against the shadows of the past and the uncertainties of the future. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Grand Alexandria Museum's grand facade, painting the ancient stones in hues of amber and gold. From the outside, the museum appeared serene, majestic, a timeless monument to human history and culture, a beacon of knowledge in the bustling metropolis. But within its hallowed halls, beneath the veneer of normalcy, a subtle shift had occurred, a profound transformation that only those who had witnessed the night's events could truly perceive. The silence of the artifacts was no longer just the stillness of inanimate objects. It was a deeper silence, a peaceful slumber, a contented quietude, as if the ancient spirits within had finally found rest, their restless energy calmed, their ancient slumber undisturbed once more. The museum, scarred but not broken, violated but ultimately cleansed, stood resilient, a silent guardian against the darkness, its ancient stones imbued with a newfound strength, a quiet determination to protect the secrets it held, to safeguard the world from the ancient powers that lay dormant beneath the surface of reality, waiting for their moment to awaken once more. The fragile peace of the dawn-lit Hall of Dynasties was deceptive. Despite the stillness of the inert artifacts and the subdued presence of the bound cultists, Evelyn felt a lingering unease, a subtle tremor in the air that belied the apparent victory. The devourer might be banished, Thorne vanquished, but the air still crackled with residual energy, a faint echo of the ancient power that had been unleashed and then abruptly contained. It was like the aftermath of a violent storm, the sky clearing, the sun breaking through, but the scent of ozone and the debris scattered around a stark reminder of the tempest that had just passed. Anubis, ever perceptive, seemed to sense her unease. The disruption was effective, Dr. Hayes, they said, their voice low, but the entity's influence lingers. A cleansing is needed to ensure its complete banishment to purify this space. The other keepers nodded in agreement, their cloaked forms radiating a quiet intensity, their senses attuned to the subtle energies still swirling within the hall. Evelyn looked around at the scene of the night's battle, the scattered artifacts, the subdued cultists, the scorched mark on the floor. The hall, though physically intact, felt violated, defiled by the dark ritual that had been performed within its ancient walls. A cleansing ritual, a counter-ritual felt necessary, not just to banish the lingering influence, but to restore the hall, to reclaim its sanctity, to heal the psychic wounds inflicted upon the museum. What kind of cleansing ritual? Evelyn asked, turning back to Anubis, her voice still weak but laced with a growing sense of urgency. "What do we need to do?" Anubis considered for a moment, their hooded gaze sweeping across the hall, assessing the residual energies, the lingering shadows. "A ritual of purification," they said finally. "One to dispel the darkness, to restore balance, to reconsecrate this space to its original purpose, a sanctuary of knowledge, a repository of history, not a conduit for ancient chaos." Anubis turned to Evelyn, their gaze direct, their voice firm. "You are the curator, Dr. Hayes. You are the keeper of this hall. You must perform this ritual. We will guide you, we will assist you, but the power must flow through you. The cleansing must come from your heart, your will, your connection to this place." Evelyn felt a surge of both fear and determination. Another ritual, another confrontation with ancient forces after the exhausting ordeal of the night. But she knew Anubis was right. She was the curator, the keeper of this hall. The responsibility fell to her, the burden of cleansing, of restoring balance, of ensuring the museum's continued safety. She had faced the Devourer's influence once, she had survived, she had prevailed. She could do it again, she had to. "Tell me what to do," Evelyn said, her voice gaining strength, her weariness momentarily forgotten in the face of this new challenge. "Tell me what ritual is needed, what I must perform." Anubis nodded, their gaze approving. "We will use the artifacts themselves, Dr. Hayes. We will repurpose the objects of darkness, transforming them into instruments of light. We will use the canopic jars, the offering bowls, the amulets, not to summon chaos, but to dispel it, to purify this space, to banish the lingering influence of the Devourer." Anubis gestured to the other keepers, issuing silent instructions. The keepers moved with practiced efficiency, gathering the inert artifacts, rearranging them within the hall, transforming the chaotic remnants of Thorn's ritual into the components of a counter-ritual, a cleansing ceremony. Guided by Anubis and assisted by the keepers, Evelyn began to prepare for the cleansing ritual. They rearranged the canopic jars, not in a menacing semicircle as Thorn had done, but in a protective circle around Evelyn, their alabaster surfaces now radiating a soft, calming light. Their spectral Anubis guardians now silent and watchful, no longer snarling but serene, almost benevolent. The offering bowls, once erupting in spectral flames, were now filled with fresh water, purified by ancient incantations whispered by the keepers, the water shimmering with a gentle, cleansing energy. The amulets, once buzzing like deadly insects, were now arranged around the perimeter of the hall, forming a protective barrier, their surfaces radiating a soft, golden light, their protective symbols now empowered with positive energy, warding off any lingering darkness. Anubis instructed Evelyn in the ancient chants, the words of purification, the invocations to the benevolent deities of light and order, the counterspells to banish the residual influence of the Devourer. The words were ancient, resonant, imbued with a power that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the museum, echoing the echoes of countless rituals performed in this space over millennia. As Evelyn chanted, her voice, though still weak, gained strength, resonating with a newfound authority. A connection to the ancient energies flowing through the museum, through the artifacts, through her own being. As the cleansing ritual began, a subtle shift occurred within the hall. The lingering unease, the faint tremor in the air, intensified, becoming more pronounced, more unsettling. The shadows in the corners of the hall seemed to deepen, to writhe, to coalesce into indistinct forms, as if the banished Devourer was resisting the purification, fighting back against the encroaching light, its residual influence struggling to maintain its hold on the space. A faint whisper echoed through the hall, a sibilant sound, barely audible, yet undeniably present. A psychic murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a voice of ancient darkness, resisting banishment, clinging to existence. The museum itself seemed to react to the cleansing ritual, to the entity's resistance. A low tremor ran through the building, a subtle vibration that resonated through the marble floors, the colossal statues, the very foundations of the Grand Alexandria. Display cases rattled gently, ancient artifacts shifted minutely on their pedestals. The high arched windows vibrated softly, a low hum resonating through the glass. The museum itself groaning under the strain of the psychic battle, the clash between light and darkness, purification and resistance. The psychic whisper intensified, becoming more distinct, more menacing, no longer a murmur but a voice. A sibilant hiss that seemed to penetrate Evelyn's mind, whispering insidious words, tempting her with promises of power, of knowledge, of forbidden secrets, seeking to corrupt the cleansing ritual, to turn it into a summoning, to re-establish the Devourer's connection to the museum, to reclaim its hold on this ancient space. Evelyn felt a cold tendril of psychic influence reach into her mind, probing her thoughts, her fears, her desires, seeking to exploit her weariness, her vulnerability, to turn her against the cleansing ritual, to corrupt her will, to make her a vessel for the Devourer's return. Images flashed through her mind, distorted visions of power and darkness, temptations of forbidden knowledge, whispers of ancient secrets, promises of unimaginable power, all designed to lure her, to seduce her, to break her resolve. She fought back fiercely, desperately, focusing her will, her mind, her very being against the psychic assault, drawing strength from the ancient chants, from the protective circle of canopic jars, from the unwavering presence of the keepers, from the memory of David's sacrifice, from her own deep connection to the museum, to its history, to its purpose as a sanctuary of knowledge and light. She pushed back against the insidious whispers, against the tempting visions, against the encroaching darkness, channeling her life force, her will to resist, to banish, to purify, to reclaim the museum from the Devourer's influence. The museum trembled more violently now, the low tremor escalating into a perceptible shaking, the walls groaning, the display cases rattling more loudly, the high-arched windows vibrating more intensely, the building itself protesting against the psychic battle raging within its ancient walls. Dust rained down from the high ceilings, the air growing thick with the scent of disturbed dust and ozone, the museum itself seemingly groaning under the strain of the entity's desperate resistance, the clash of ancient powers. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the Hall of Dynasties burst open, crashing against the walls with a resounding boom, shattering the ritualistic calm, interrupting the chanting, flooding the hall with harsh light from the museum corridors, and revealing a chaotic scene of uniformed security guards pouring into the hall, weapons drawn, their faces grim, their eyes wide with alarm and confusion. Leading the charge, his face pale but resolute, his weapon raised, was Captain Mark Olson. Olson, responding to the earlier alarm, had finally rallied his security forces, breaching the Hall of Dynasties, expecting to find chaos, cultists, perhaps even armed resistance. But he was confronted with a scene even more bewildering, more unsettling than he could have imagined: cloaked figures chanting, artifacts glowing, the museum itself shaking, and Dr. Hayes seemingly at the center of it all, her face pale but determined, her voice resonating with ancient words, surrounded by a circle of glowing canopic jars. Confusion warred with alarm on Olson's face, skepticism battling against the undeniable evidence of the impossible unfolding before his eyes. But there was no time for questions, no time for explanations. As Olson and his security team surged into the hall, the psychic backlash intensified, the Devourer's resistance reaching a fever pitch, its influence lashing out in a final, desperate attempt to disrupt the cleansing ritual, to reclaim its hold on the museum. A wave of psychic energy erupted from the altar, a visible ripple in the air, a distortion of light and shadow, a blast of raw, chaotic power that slammed into the hall, throwing cultists and keepers alike off their feet, sending animated amulets scattering wildly, extinguishing the gentle glow of the canopic jars and the offering bowls, plunging the hall back into a chaotic darkness, broken only by the flickering candlelight and the harsh glare of the security guards' flashlights. Evelyn, caught in the epicenter of the psychic blast, staggered back, her vision blurring, her mind reeling, the insidious whispers intensifying, threatening to overwhelm her will, to shatter her resolve. She felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, a searing heat that radiated outwards, a sudden weakness that threatened to buckle her knees. She cried out, stumbling, falling, the dark feather slipping from her grasp, tumbling to the marble floor, its inert form now powerless, its connection severed. As Evelyn fell, a figure moved swiftly, intercepting the psychic blast, shielding her from the full force of the entity's backlash. A dark shape lunged in front of her, absorbing the brunt of the chaotic energy, taking the psychic impact, protecting her from the full force of the Devourer's wrath. A grunt of pain echoed through the hall, a sharp intake of breath, a muffled cry. Then the figure crumpled, falling to the floor beside Evelyn, their bodies shielding her from the residual energy, their forms still, silent, unmoving. Evelyn's vision cleared, her mind slowly regaining focus, the insidious whispers receding, the psychic assault weakening. She looked down, her gaze falling upon the figure who had shielded her, who had taken the brunt of the psychic blast, who had sacrificed themselves to protect her. It was Olsen. Captain Mark Olsen, the gruff, skeptical security captain, the man who had initially dismissed her concerns, but who had ultimately come to believe, to understand, to fight alongside her against the encroaching darkness. Olsen lay still, his eyes closed, his face pale, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his uniform, blooming crimson against the stark blue fabric. A wound visible on his shoulder, mirroring her own but deeper, more severe, a gaping tear in his flesh, oozing blood, a testament to the psychic force he had absorbed, the sacrifice he had made. "Olsen," Evelyn cried out, her voice filled with anguish, reaching out to him, her hand hovering over his still form, her heart sinking with a wave of grief and terror. Olsen, wounded, perhaps dying, protecting her from the Devourer's wrath, sacrificing himself in the chaotic darkness of the Hall of Dynasties. A final, selfless act of courage and loyalty. A testament to the unlikely alliance they had forged, the unexpected bond they had created in the face of ancient evil. The cleansing ritual was disrupted, the hall plunged back into chaos, Olsen lay wounded, and the full moon, now at its zenith, cast its eerie glow through the shattered silence. A silent promise of more darkness to come. But Anubis and the keepers, witnessing Olsen's sacrifice and Evelyn's distress, acted swiftly. Two keepers moved to Olsen's side, their cloaked forms kneeling beside him, their hands moving with swift, precise movements, their voices murmuring ancient incantations, their fingers tracing symbols of healing and protection over his wounded shoulder. A faint golden light emanated from their hands, bathing Olsen's still form in a warm, ethereal glow. A visible manifestation of their ancient healing arts, their desperate attempt to mend the psychic wound, to draw him back from the brink. Anubis, meanwhile, turned to Evelyn, their gaze firm, their voice resolute. "Dr. Hayes, the ritual must be completed. Olsen's sacrifice has bought us time, has weakened the entity, but the cleansing is not yet finished. You must continue, for Olsen, for the museum, for the world." Anubis reached down, picking up the inert dark feather, pressing it back into Evelyn's trembling hand. "Channel your grief, your gratitude, your resolve. Use this feather as a focus, as a conduit. Finish the ritual, Dr. Hayes. Banish the darkness. Honor Olsen's sacrifice." Evelyn looked down at Olsen's still form, at the keepers working frantically to heal him, at the dark feather in her hand, now feeling strangely warm, imbued with a new energy, a resonance of Olsen's sacrifice, a spark of his unwavering courage. Tears streamed down her face, but her gaze hardened with a newfound resolve. She would not let Olsen's sacrifice be in vain. She would finish the ritual. She would banish the darkness. She would honor his memory by completing the task they had started together, by protecting the museum, by safeguarding the world from the encroaching evil. With a deep breath, Evelyn stood tall, her voice rising again, her ancient chants resuming, stronger, more resolute, infused with a raw emotion, a fierce determination, a burning desire to honor Olsen's sacrifice, to banish the darkness, to reclaim the light. The keepers' voices joined hers again, their incantations weaving a tapestry of sound, a chorus of light against the whispers of darkness, a symphony of banishment, of purification, of hope. As they chanted, the hall began to resonate again, the artifacts stirring, the gentle glow returning, stronger now, more focused, more determined. The white light erupted from the altar once more, even more brilliant, more intense, more all-encompassing than before. A wave of pure, cleansing energy washing over the hall, banishing the remaining shadows, dispelling the lingering darkness, purifying every corner, every artifact, every soul within its ancient walls. The museum trembled again, but this time the vibration was not a protest, but a resonance, a harmonious hum, a building breathing deeply, expelling the last vestiges of darkness, embracing the light completely, finally, and irrevocably. As the light subsided, the profound silence returned, even deeper, more complete than before, a silence of utter peace, of perfect stillness, of absolute tranquility. The hall was cleansed, purified, restored. The devourer was banished utterly and completely, its influence erased, its presence banished from this realm. Thorn was gone, consumed by his own ambition, his darkness extinguished, his threat neutralized. The cultists lay still, unconscious, their fervor broken, their darkness dispelled, their minds cleansed, their future uncertain but no longer a threat. The keepers, their task completed, their ancient healing arts expended, stood silent and watchful, their cloaked forms radiating a quiet satisfaction, their mission accomplished. And Olsen, lying still on the marble floor, the crimson stain on his uniform slowly fading, his breathing becoming deeper, more regular, his eyelids fluttering slightly. A faint sign of life returning, a fragile hope flickering in the stillness of the dawnlit hall, a testament to the power of sacrifice, the resilience of courage, and the enduring strength of the human spirit, even in the face of ancient darkness. The museum was safe, the world was spared, and the light, however fragile, had prevailed. The dawn had truly broken, and a new chapter, uncertain but hopeful, was about to begin. In the quiet aftermath, as the first rays of true sunlight streamed through the museum windows, painting the Hall of Dynasties in a warm, golden light, Evelyn and Anubis watched with bated breath as Olsen's eyelids fluttered again, then slowly, hesitantly opened. His eyes, though still clouded with fatigue and pain, focused, recognizing Evelyn, a faint flicker of his familiar gruffness returning to his gaze. "Hayes," he rasped, his voice weak, barely a whisper. What happened?" Relief washed over Evelyn in a warm wave, so profound it almost buckled her knees. He was alive, he was awake. Olsen, against all odds, had survived. "You saved us, Captain," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion, tears welling up in her eyes again, this time tears of gratitude and overwhelming relief. "You took the blast, you shielded me, you saved the museum." Olsen managed a weak, lopsided grin, a ghost of his usual sardonic smile. "Just doing my job, Doc," he murmured, his voice still faint but laced with a hint of his characteristic dry humor. "Protect and serve, right," he coughed weakly, wincing in pain. Though pretty sure ancient Egyptian curse wasn't in the job description. Anubis stepped forward, their voice low and reassuring. "Captain Olsen, you have shown extraordinary courage and selflessness. Your sacrifice was instrumental in our victory. The keepers have done what we can to heal your physical wounds, but the psychic impact was significant. Rest is essential, and time." Olsen nodded slowly, his gaze drifting around the hall, taking in the stillness, the inert artifacts, the subdued security guards now gently assisting the keepers with the subdued cultists. "Looks quiet now," he murmured, his voice fading again. "Too quiet." "Peaceful, Captain," Evelyn corrected gently, smiling through her tears. "It's peaceful now, the ritual is disrupted, the devourer is banished, Thorn is gone." Olsen closed his eyes again, a sigh of relief escaping his lips. "Good," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Good riddance to bad rubbish, and curses, and gods." His breathing deepened, his body relaxing, finally succumbing to exhaustion, slipping back into a healing slumber, but this time, a peaceful, restful sleep, no longer haunted by nightmares, no longer threatened by ancient darkness. As Olsen rested, Evelyn and Anubis turned their attention to the future, to the long and arduous task of rebuilding, of understanding, of preventing future occurrences. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the underlying mysteries, the shadowy forces, the lingering questions about the Osiris Foundation remained. David's USB drive, now safely in the Keeper's possession, held the key to exposing Thorn's treachery and the Foundation's hidden agendas. But unraveling the full extent of their influence, reforming the organization, ensuring accountability, would be a complex and challenging undertaking. A battle fought not with ancient rituals and psychic powers, but with modern tools of investigation, transparency, and legal action. Evelyn knew her life had irrevocably changed. The museum, once a place of quiet scholarship and academic pursuit, had become a battleground, a nexus of ancient forces, a stage for drama that had tested her courage, her resolve, and her very understanding of reality. She was no longer just a curator. She was a guardian, a protector, forever bound to the mysteries of ancient Egypt, forever vigilant for signs of the entity's return, forever changed by her experience. And yet, amidst the exhaustion, the grief, and the lingering unease, a sense of purpose had solidified within her, a newfound dedication to understanding the ancient world, not just as a scholar, but as a protector, a guardian, a keeper of secrets, a warrior against the darkness. The Osiris Foundation's secrets, once shrouded in mystery and veiled pronouncements, began to unravel in the days and weeks that followed. The keepers, true to their word, meticulously analyzed David's evidence, the USB drive containing Thorne's encrypted communications, financial records, and ritualistic plans. Working in the shadows, utilizing their own network of contacts and resources, they discreetly leaked the information to select journalists, to trusted members of law enforcement, to individuals within the Osiris Foundation itself who were known to be opposed to Thorne's faction and his extreme methods. The revelations were explosive, sending shockwaves through the art world, the archaeological community, and the corridors of power. The Osiris Foundation, once revered for its philanthropic endeavors and its patronage of cultural institutions, was exposed as a deeply fractured organization, riddled with internal power struggles, its leadership compromised by factions vying for control, some seeking to exploit ancient knowledge and artifacts for personal gain, for power, for something far more sinister than mere academic curiosity. Thorne's faction, his clandestine operations, his ritualistic activities, his ruthless ambition for godhood, it all came to light, a dark and disturbing exposé that shattered the Foundation's carefully cultivated public image. The scandal triggered a massive internal investigation, spearheaded by the rival faction, the Keeper's allies within the Foundation, those who were genuinely committed to the organization's original mission of preservation and knowledge, those horrified by Thorne's treachery and his near-catastrophic actions. The reforms within the Osiris Foundation were sweeping and profound. The old guard, those associated with Thorne's faction or complicit in his activities, were purged from leadership positions, replaced by individuals committed to transparency, accountability, and ethical practices. The Foundation's funding structure, its acquisition policies, its oversight mechanisms, all were subjected to rigorous scrutiny and radical overhaul. The veil of secrecy that had long shrouded the organization was lifted, replaced by a commitment to openness and public accountability, a desperate attempt to regain public trust and salvage its reputation. The Grand Alexandria Museum, though initially caught in the crossfire of the scandal, emerged from the crisis stronger, more resilient, and more deeply committed to its mission of preserving and sharing the wonders of the past. Evelyn, hailed as a hero by the museum staff and the wider community, found herself at the center of this transformation. Her quiet dedication, her unwavering courage, her deep connection to the artifacts, recognized and celebrated. She was no longer just a curator. She was a symbol of hope, a guardian of the museum, a protector of ancient knowledge, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Olsen, slowly but surely, recovered from his psychic wound, his skepticism tempered by his first-hand experience of the impossible, his gruff exterior softened by the profound sacrifice he had made, the unlikely bond he had forged with Evelyn, the newfound respect for the ancient mysteries that lay hidden beneath the surface of the modern world. He returned to his post as head of security, no longer just a pragmatic captain of guards, but a watchful protector, a silent guardian of the museum, his gaze now attuned to the subtle energies, the lingering shadows, the whispers of the unseen world. Life in the Grand Alexandria Museum settled into a new rhythm, a delicate balance between normalcy and vigilance, between scholarly pursuit and silent guardianship. The Hall of Dynasties, meticulously cleansed and restored, stood once more in silent grandeur, its ancient artifacts radiating a peaceful energy, their secrets guarded, their power contained, their silence a promise of enduring mystery and enduring wonder. But Evelyn, forever changed by her experience, knew that the silence was not absolute, that the ancient mysteries were not fully solved, that the darkness was not entirely banished. She dedicated her life to understanding the echoes of the past, to deciphering the whispers of ancient knowledge, to remaining vigilant for any sign of the entity's return, any hint of the encroaching darkness, her gaze always fixed on the horizon, her spirit forever bound to the mysteries of ancient Egypt and the ongoing, unseen battle against the shadows of time. The Grand Alexandria Museum, under her watchful gaze, stood ready, a beacon of light against the unknown, its ancient stones whispering secrets of power and peril, of darkness and dawn, of a story far from over, a mystery yet to fully unfold.